Welcome, gentle listener. I am Baldermort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the factions, forces, and faces of the Warhammer 40k setting, the grim darkness of the far future, where there is no time for peace, there is only time for war. And today, I now enter a brief period where I take a rest, regroup, and start writing even more. But I do need a break. Alas, I have the urge to do some personal projects in writing, possibly even a novel. So we'll be attempting that in my period off. No, it can't be Warhammer. But hopefully some will think it of worth, if I manage that first draft. A dream for decades, and I have few of those left, so best get on with it, as they say. You never know what you can do until you try. Hence, as usual, I will be releasing some compilations of my own wee stories to tide me over. YouTube can be a harsh taskmaster, and videos need to be uploaded continuously. So, in this period, I put out collections to paint or sleep with. I hope you enjoy this compilation for what it is, and I thank you, gentle listener, for all of your support over the year and years. You truly have changed everything in my life. Thank you. I can only hope that I have made some kind of beneficial impact in yours. Now, to the stories. Warzone Valedor, 999 Millennium 41. The violent death of Valador, a planet torn asunder. The battle for the Valador system culminates upon Valador itself, known to the Eldar as Duel, a once beautiful planet invaded by mankind, brought to ruin by the Tyranids, and pushed over the brink of destruction by the Eldar themselves. The Great Devourer strikes. Since the brutal intrusion of the High Fleets across the eastern fringe, even the proudest Eldar mind has quailed at the Tyranid threat. So great is the menace of the invaders from beyond the void that the prophets of the Eldar race cried tears of blood at their coming. The autarchs and farseers of the craft worlds know well that the tactic of evasion is of little use against an enemy capable of assailing such great swathes of space. Waiting for the invaders to expend themselves is not a viable solution either. The Tau Empire is but a single shield against a tide, and, to the incredulity of the Eldar, the Imperium of Man is making matters worse by feeding the ravenous Hive Fleets entire generations of warriors in a ham-fisted attempt to stop their advance. The seers and scholars of the Eldar craft worlds had long suspected that the Tyranid race grew stronger with every world it conquered, primarily due to the gargantuan bioships at the heart of each Hive fleet. These monstrosities render down the harvested matter of their victims, combining it with the liquefied corpses of those Tyranids killed in the attack and subsequently reclaimed. Each new race the Tyranids encountered is killed, consumed, boiled down to biological gruel, and used to create ever more deadly weapon beasts from the resultant raw materials. It was this accelerated evolution that the Eldar sought to stop in the Valador system, for should the High Fleets continue on their rampage, the craft worlds of the future would be doomed. Unbeknownst to them, the resultant war would force them to destroy the world of Duel altogether. The Valador system. Valadan. Primitive class stellar body. Valadan is a relatively stable star, and its light and warmth allow complex ecosystems to flourish on several of its orbiting planets. It is theorized by Imperial cosmologicals that only stable, life-giving stars, such as Valadan, attract the attention of Tyranid Hive Fleets, to whom a planetary system that allows a proliferation of biomass is most vital of all resources. The death world of Dare bursts into flame every time its elliptical orbit draws it close to Valadan. Oddly, This did not stop the advance of High Fleet Leviathan approaching the planet in year 999 Millennium 41, presumably seeking the genetic secrets of hyper-durable life forms with which to bolster their own weapon beasts. Megas, mining world. Until the latter part of year 999, the mining planet of Megas was a thriving subsidiary to Valador. The rich veins of adamantium that ran through its crust meant that its mining settlements numbered in the thousands, and its planetary defense force was amongst the strongest in the sector. The planet was invaded and effectively destroyed within 6 days by the seething wrath of High Fleet Leviathan, despite a spirited orbital defense from the guard vessels that escorted its rich bounty to Valador, and the courageous but ultimately hopeless efforts of the Imperial Guard regiment stationed there. Valador, civilized world. Known to the Eldar as Duel, Valador was planet-scaped, along with the rest of the system in the mists of prehistory. It was intended as a safe haven for the ancient Eldar when their empire rose again. However, the arrival of Imperial settlers in year 311 Millennium 39 saw the planet brought into compliance with Imperial tithe bans within a decade. By the end of year 321, it was reclassified from Viridian class Mundus Novum to fully civilized world status. The planet's thriving fortunes were to come to an abrupt end in year 999, when the warp breach vortex of despair flared back into life, spitting out what appeared to be a translocated splinter of High Fleet Kraken. Ector, Hive World. The Hive World of Ector was the first Imperial world to bear the brunt of the questing tendrils of High Fleet Kraken. The planet's ice caps were invaded first, for they harbored a great deal of biomass in the form of large and aggressive polar fauna. Ector was a recruiting ground for the Crimson Castellans chapter, and housed a garrison of 20 Space Marines at the time of the invasion. The Space Marines coordinated the defenses of Ector's principal hive cities with such efficiency that it held out for a full 3 months before the Tyranid swarms overran them. Nuen, Perditus-class world. Nuen is tainted by the warp rift that interrupts its orbit. It has been declared Perditus ever since the demon storms of year 442, Millennium 35. The rapid evolutionary leaps made by the womb beasts, known as Norn Queens, ensure the Tyranid swarms adapt at shocking speed to overcome their prey's technological advantages. With each piece of knowledge gained, and with each grotesque adaptation, the Hive Fleet increases the lethality of its warriors in preparation for the next wave of assaults. To the Eldar, the Tyranids represent an aspect of their mythological dragon concept, mindless destruction made manifest and set loose upon the stars. The Eldar know in their hearts that they must take up the challenge and fight the monster laying waste to their ancient domains, for only they have wisdom enough to defeat it. Yet they fear to do so, for their numbers are few, and the Tyranids are many, functionally infinite, if the Farseers are to be believed. One such visionary was Teeg Silvereye of Iyanden, a gifted but eccentric seer, whose prophecies of invasion were proved unerringly accurate during the fall of Iyanden. Perhaps, had his peers listened to him, they would have avoided disaster. Perhaps the craft world's near demise was inevitable. Either way, the tragic fate of Iyanden had become well known throughout the ruins of the Eldar civilization, a cautionary tale against underestimating the Tyranid race. A single tendril of High Fleet Kraken had detected, hunted down, and slaughtered the greater part of Craftworld Yanden's populace before being repelled at great cost. In the process, the once vibrant world ship was reduced to skeletal ruin, and its people were forced to wake their dead and plunge them back into the fires of war so the living could hope to survive. Sorrow and banishment. A Tyranid Hive Fleet is of an unimaginable scale. Escaping its grasp is no easy feat, This proved truest of High Fleet Kraken, the most insidious of their kind. Unlike the sledgehammer assault of High Fleet Behemoth, Kraken attacked in a series of questing, spacefaring tendrils, each comprised of hundreds of bioships that probed the defense of the High Fleet's foes before driving home its attack against its weakest point. Just as all seemed lost for the beleaguered craftworld of Iyanden, the tendril constricting it had been defeated by the return of Prince Iriel's Corsair fleet. The Pyrrhic victory of the Eldar, in conjunction with the actions of the Imperial forces upon Ikar IV, shattered the main tendrils of High Fleet Kraken and reduced the bulk of the High Fleet to little more than a painful memory. However, the small tendrils that yet floated in the void were still enough to deal the death blow, should they bring Iyanden to battle once more. In the process of extricating themselves from the devastation of the Eastern Fringe, the seers of Iyanden harnessed the psychic backlash of their craftworld's near extinction. In a long and dangerous meditation ritual, they magnified these negative energies until they resonated through Iyanden's infinity circuit, the psychic matrix that forms the skeleton of each titanic world ship. All the death and terror of the craft world was focused in a single point in time and space. The emotional energy pouring out of the warring craft world was so intense that it collapsed the veil between real space and immaterium, boring a hole in reality and leaving a temporary warp storm in the craft world's wake. Several of the smaller tendrils questing towards the escaping world ship recoiled from the gnawing lesion it left behind, fleeing in disarray from the hellish portal. The tendril of High Fleet Kraken that was nearest to Iyanden, however, was not fast enough to escape. Writhing like a living thing, it was drawn into the sea of unreality beyond the vortex. The grieving Eldar cared little about what became of the splinter fleet that had vanished into the warp. Immediate survival was their first and only priority. For many, it was felt that sending the remainder of the High Fleet into a demon-infested hell realm had a macabre elegance, though the act of opening such a large and potentially permanent wound in reality was strictly forbidden. The tactic had made Iyanden's escape a certainty. It was an act that would come back to haunt them. The tides of the warp are fickle, and the gods that dwell within the immaterium revel in cruelty. The awful scale of the High Fleet's threat had been made clear. The coming of the Tyranids would also certainly see the galaxy torn open and the Eldar race dwindle even further towards extinction, a fate that could not be borne. Several years after the events that had brought craftworld Iyanden to its knees, the seer Teeg Silvereye predicted a far-off war whose ultimate consequences could finish Iyanden once and for all. His prophetic abilities had been proven beyond all doubt during the invasion of Iyanden, and so the Farseer's cryptic words were relayed with all haste to the High Council of the Craft World. Led by the beautiful spirit seer Iana Arianal, the seers of Iyanden cast their runes and sent their minds along the skeins of fate. Together, the seers had the strength to penetrate the lingering psychic shadow cast by the Tyranids to investigate Silvereye's prophecy firsthand. What they saw in the skeins of fate drove them to the edge of panic. The Tyranid High Fleet that had caught Iyanden in its grasp still bore the psychic spore of the Eldar minds it had tasted during the Battle of Iyanden. Its creatures carried a faint but traceable stain of angst, a thin patina of soul stuff that only the most gifted Eldar psychers in the galaxy could detect. The spirit seers of Iyanden excelled above all others in matters beyond the veil, and their Farseer colleagues guided their journeys across the void with expert precision. In this way, the High Fleet's passage could be followed across the trackless wastes of deep space. As a hunting ritual reached completion, each of the spirit seers cried out in shock. The splinter fleet that had been swallowed by the warp storm had not been destroyed as they had hoped, or trapped amongst immaterial doldrums, but instead vomited out of the lesion in real space known as the Vortex of Despair. It was heading towards a world infested by Tyranids, those of High Fleet Leviathan. The newest of the High Fleets to have penetrated the galaxy, Leviathan had glutted itself on the biomass of hundreds of Imperial worlds before plunging into the Orc Empire of Octarius. The Imperium of Man had bought itself time by evacuating or destroying those worlds in Leviathan's path and diverting the Hive Fleet into Orcoid space, but in the process it had exceeded its inability to halt the Hive Fleet's inexorable advance. The Eldar would shoulder this burden alone. The assimilation of two major Hive Fleets could be disastrous, for the Tyranid's evolutionary process would run riot, producing ever deadlier strains of warrior constructs with the biological bounty they reaped. Should the armies of Kraken and Leviathan be reclaimed by the same bioships, those Tyranids that had tasted the genius of Iandan and those grown strong on the tough genetic stock of orcs would combine into a new breed of super predator. Within the veiny wombs of the brood ships, an array of physically mighty and fiercely intelligent beasts would be born, an unstoppably potent strain of Tyranids that would spread across the stars to overwhelm the resistance of Eldar, man, and orc alike. Deep in the galactic south, the world of Duel glowed golden in the firmament, a luminous world of tropical heat and balmy seasons. It orbited at the ideal distance from its sun for sentient colonization. The planet had always had a favored existence under the auspices of the Eldar, but not merely through chance, for that ancient race had long ago planet-scaped whole worlds to their whims. Yana Arianal believed that Silver Eye's prophecy pointed to Duriel's recent conquest by the Tyranid Voidspawn. The planet's name meant lambent fire in the Eldar tongue, and the Spirit Seer claimed that the prophecy's references to a dying flame meant that lambent fire was about to be snuffed out. The Seer Council was assembled, and the runes of seeing were cast. As the Eldar scried the paths of the future, they were appalled by Duriel's fate. Since its days as a radiant gemstone in the crown of the Eldar Empire, the runes implied that the once glorious world had not only been conquered by mankind, but also brought to the brink of ruin by the Tyranids. 10,000 years ago, the planet of Duriel had been scoured clean of Eldar by the psychic shockwave of their empire's self-destruction. All that was left was the cadavers of those whose souls had been taken by Slaanesh. Soulless husks which eventually rotted and crumbled to dust. However, the works of the Eldar are built to endure the passage of time. When the crude warships of the Imperium settler fleets made planetfall, the Eldar's architecture, art, and landworks endured. The Imperium slowly settled the abandoned world with its own people and set about the systematic destruction of every single thing the Eldar had made. After a decade of hard labor and controlled detonations, the lands of the world were carpeted by ivory-hued dust, punctuated by fist-sized chunks of psychoplastic and spars of wraithbone. The Imperium rebuilt Duriel with grinding predictability, covering the once golden meadows with thick black ferrocrete and erecting cathedrals and hab blocks in which the constant influx of settlers could live and worship their emperor. Over the years, Duriel was changed completely. Millennia of abuse saw the planet's forests wither to twisted, petrified stumps. Its warm oceans dried up entirely as the populace coaxed more and more geothermic power from the planet's core. War, disease, and strife raged back and forth across the planet as the Imperium beat its destiny into the world. Yet the yoke of mankind was a kind fate in comparison to the coming of the Tyranids. The warrior swarms of Leviathan overcame the Imperial defenses in a series of bloody victories that took less than a week. Then the feeding process began in earnest, but still the planet's woes were not over. Even as Leviathan rained billions of voracious feeder organisms onto the planet's surface, the splinter fleet of Hive Fleet Kraken drifted towards Duriel to join the feast. The runic divinations of Iandan's Farseers implied that the splinter fleet had been cast out of its strange odyssey in the warp, deliberately ejected if the runes spoke true, and had poured forth from the vortex of despair to head straight for Duriel. Even if Iandan's armies risked the shattered tunnels of the Webway en masse, the chances of making planetfall in time to stop the Tyranid high fleets merging were dangerously small. Only craft-world Bieltan, gliding through the galactic south on its own unfinished business, had any hope of reaching the war zone before the high fleets mingled. Wasting no time, the Seer Council of Iandan sent a psychic plea for the intervention of their cousins on Bieltan. Concerned that this was not their fight to win, Bieltan's war council was divided as to whether they should unleash the swordwind, until Iana Arianel sent them a message consisting of a single word she knew would resonate within their warrior hearts: extermination. Within the space of a few hours, craftworld Bieltan was drifting purposefully towards Duel, to make their final approach directly through real space, and hence stray into the path of the converging high fleets would be pure folly. Bieltan would likely suffer the same fate as Iandan. Instead, the Swordwind's war hosts made careful use of the Webway's widest passageways to complete the journey to the Tyranid-infested world. A steady stream of sleek grav tanks and swooping flying squadrons flashed out of the ancient Webway portals that glittered atop Duriel's highest mountains. The Tyranids in the valley below were entirely unaware of the skimmers taking position in the spore-choked clouds above. The component parts of the Swordwind carefully maintained arrowhead formations at the heart of each cloud bank, and elite wings of Crimson Hunters swooped past the Falcons and Wave Serpents as they took up prearranged positions. Before the sun had set, an invisible army of Eldar had gathered in the skies. By the next morning, they had spread out across the planet, located the Tyranids of the Kraken swarms that were to be their prey, and reconvened above them, all without leaving the cover of the clouds. By the time the sun rose, the Eldar were in position to strike from a mustering point high above the mountain known as the Godspeak. Beneath them, a crimson sea of Tyranid chitin stretched across the valley and beyond. A great swathe of Tyranids from the Kraken splinter fleet swept across the plain, bounding towards the distant swarms of High Fleet Leviathan, with the intent of harvesting as much biomass as possible, rival Tyranids included. The Eater Beasts of Leviathan were oblivious to the approach of Kraken's armies. They were preoccupied with devouring the biomass of Duriel's twisted forests, and once their gullets were full, hurling themselves into the steaming pools of acid that dotted the planet's ravaged landscape. Though they knew it not, the swarms were about to combine. Should the Tyranids of the Kraken splinter fleet join the feast, and should their biomass be merged together in the acidic digestion pools, all the bioships would have to do to reap the bounty of both was absorb the bubbling acidic gruel from the capillary towers spouting from each pool. There was no time to waste. In order to keep the two Tyranid swarms separate, the armies of the Eldar had to strike as hard and as fast as they could. Out of the skies came the swordwind, waves of gravcraft bursting from the clouds as pulsars and scattered lasers spat bolts of white-hot death into the massed Tyranids below. The shuriken catapults and cannons of Bieltan's guardian battle hosts raked great furrows across the vanguard of the splinter fleet swarm, clawing up Tyranids and cracked earth alike. The fury of the sudden assault forced the Tyranids to seek cover amongst the twisted vegetation. As the beast milled in confusion, squads of brightly coloured aspect warriors debarked onto the plateaus that dotted the Valley of the Gods, assessing their prey before falling upon the Xenos below. Autarch Awoke Sunspear of Bieltan had long studied the Tyranids, and he knew well that the swarm's cohesion could be broken by the destruction of a few choice targets. As Sunspear calmly relayed his commands, Dark Reapers strode to the cliff-like edges of the Godspeak messers. Their missile salvos detonated amongst the Tyranid warriors that were marshalling the swarm below, sending chitinous limbs and broken bone swords in all directions. Heavy weapons flickering, squadrons of war walkers picked off bulbous zoanthrope broods whose psychic shields overloaded under the relentless energy beams. Fire dragons leveled tight volleys of fusion gunfire at the bulky tervigans hunkering down in the rocks. the searing agony of each kill sending out psychic shockwaves that saw termagant broods surrounding their progenitors drop writhing to the ground. Sunspear himself led an honor guard of exarchs against the snake-bodied terrors that were attempting to cut off their retreat. Through the orchestrated slaughter strode the avatar of Cain, the boundless bloodlust of Beotar made real. Tyranid leader beast died by the dozen at his hands, for his blood was fire, and he carried death in his grasp. As the dusk turned to darkness, Ortok Sunspear's plan came to fruition. Without the guidance of their synapse creatures, the Kraken swarms found themselves directionless and confused, milling around like a dammed river, swirling back on itself. The Tyranids of High Fleet Kraken had been kept separate from those of Leviathan, and the immediate danger averted, for a time at least. The Leviathan awakes. The hive mind that controls the Tyranid race has a cold and deadly intelligence, and it cannot be denied for long. After the initial surprise of the invasion, the brood beasts of the Kraken splinter fleet had scurried into 100 hiding places, scattering in all directions to evade the deadly hunters that had cut ways through their ranks. The Eldar began the systematic destruction of these warrior beasts they could find. Striking scorpions spattered the scree with alien ichor, while swooping hawks and warp spiders flitted from boulder to spire, methodically slaughtering the lesser Tyranids with las blaster volleys and monofilament webs. Yet the Tyranids of High Fleet Kraken were not alone upon the dying world of Duel. What had first appeared to be storm clouds massing in the distance soon proved to be something far more deadly. Urgent reports from the Viper Outriders of the War Host detailed an airborne swarm of staggering proportions that was inbound upon the War Host's position. The sleeping giant that was High Fleet Leviathan had been awoken. The horizon buzzed with activity as swarms beyond counting swept across the plains. Thousands of leather-winged gargoyles flocked towards the flat highlands from which the Aspect warriors had launched their assault, and though the arrowhead attack runs of the Cloudstrike squadrons above sent a great many blazing to the plains below, they could not stop them all. The chitinous mass broke over the Eldar position like a living hurricane. Thin screams filled the air as the Eldar were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of foes. Squad after squad of Aspect warriors broke and fell back to the waiting grav craft hovering at the lip of each mesa. Their pursuers pressed the assault, ravening swarms of flesh-borer beetles filling the skies with vile chitinous bodies, as the Eldar reached the apparent safety of their wave serpent and falcon transports. Shimmering clouds of the Tyranids' living ammunition boarded the transports along with them. The grav tanks sped off into the night, unaware that in the act of sealing their hatches, they had also sealed the fate of those in their holds, now little more than abattoirs, filled with Tyranid eater beasts and Eldar bones. The Living Storm. On the plateaus below, the heavier elements of the Eldar war host were fighting for their lives against the throng of winged Tyranids that had descended upon them. Harridans the size of small spacecraft burst through the swarm of gigantic wings, snatching up agile warwalkers and dashing the delicate Eldar war machines to pieces against the sheer face of the Godspeak. Hive tyrants and harpies borne on clawed pinions screamed death into those winged Eldar brave enough to weather the spore clouds that choked the skies. Hive crones carved great gouges into the wraithbone of those Eldar titans that moved to intercept the swarm, whilst below them, the Avatar's fierce red glow was hidden from sight by the volume of weapon beasts piling atop it. Ortok Sunspear had no option but to send a command pulse of withdrawal to what remained of his war host. His worst fears had closed around him like talons around a throat. The entire planet was infested. The Swordwind's only real hope of achieving a swift victory had been to attack with overwhelming force, slaughtering the Splinter Fleet, and escape before the swarms of Leviathan could bring their impossible might to bear. In this, the Eldar had failed. Though a great many of the Kraken's Splinter Fleet had been slaughtered, the deadly threat it represented remained at large. As ferocious as the Swordwind was, The invading swarms were just too numerous to overcome without outside aid. The price of that aid would prove costly indeed. Directly before the invasion of Ector, the world's planetary governor ordered the withdrawal of every man, woman, and child into the nearest hives. Each of the 20 hives had but a single space marine from the Crimson Castellan's chapter seconded to it. Their presence saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The Tyranids initially invaded from the polar caps, gleaning information about the planet's populace from its ice stations. Thousands of warrior beasts began to swarm across the plains around each of Ector's hives. They were met with disciplined fire solutions from on high. Over 1 million Tyranids were killed without significant loss. Meanwhile, a single space lane was cleared on the far side of Ector towards Valador, allowing the Crimson Castellans to evacuate a great portion of the populace. The next wave of invaders evinced a daunting evolution. Without exception, these Tyranids had wings. The larger beasts fell upon the hive's artillery from above, its crones ripping open the thinnest parts of the outer exostructure to allow great swarms of gargoyles to flood into its corridors. There were persistent rumors of mysterious Xenos warriors that shone like crystal, fighting alongside the hive gangers, led by one who introduced himself as the Hand. It was none other than Asuman, fighting to slow the hive fleet's advance. Despite his intervention, the mountainous cities fell to the winged Tyranid invaders one after another. In the end, only the intervention of the dispossessed Eldar Exodite Isarion allowed Asuman to escape an untimely death and reach Duel in safety. Desperate times. The Farseers of Bieltan, casting their runes in their craftworld's dome of crystal seers, had long suspected that the swordwind's preemptive strike would not be enough to destroy the Splinter Fleet altogether. There were simply too many of the creatures. Though one swarm might be destroyed by the blades of the swordwind, all it would take was a rain of reinforcements from the bioships, and the threat would begin anew. To attack the Tyranid forces conventionally was as futile as trying to save a harvest from a locust swarm by killing individual insects. The Farseers greeted the returning autarchs of the swordwind with grim expressions and bowed heads. There were no debates this time, no ritual observances or titles, simply a declaration that chilled all who heard it. Craftworld Iandon was inbound, but it was still too far away to help, and even should this war host successfully negotiate the Webway, conventional measures would not be enough. Even scouring the planet clean with a firestorm, a ploy much beloved by the dull-witted human strategists of the Imperium, was not guaranteed to kill those Tyranids that could burrow under Duel's surface and use its skin as a shield. As tragic as it was, the only certain way to prevent the Hive fleets uniting was to physically destroy the planet from the inside out and, in the process, exterminate every living thing upon it. This act would have been of little challenge to the Eldar Empire of old, but for the Craftworlders, it was a different matter. The power of those glory days is remembered in legend, and little else. Bieltan could still depopulate a world over time, but it had long since lost the ability to destroy a planet. Among the Farseers meditating in the Dome of Crystal Seers, the ruins of Iandon and Bieltan were orbiting the ruins of dying hope and imminent catastrophe. However, the runic symbol for Lilithantu Clava, loosely translated as the knife that stays the blade, was circling the rune for dawn. It was a jagged and unpleasant symbol, long associated with the Craftworlders' sinister cousins, the Dark Eldar. Yet it implied that aid could be sought from the unholy cities of the Webway, and still arrive in time to stop Duel's fateful assimilation. Autarch Sunspear was the only member of the Bieltan War Council to have visited Cormorant and survived. He still recalled a pathway to that surreal and twisted realm, though many of its portals were metaphysical in nature and had likely shifted over the centuries. Summoning his peers once more, Sunspear told the War Council of Bieltan that there was no way a delegation of the Swordwind could approach Cormorant without being delayed or even hunted unto death. Even if they were successful in their journey, They might not return in time to stop the Tyranid bioharvest, for the Dark Eldar were unlikely to reveal their secret paths through the Webway to outsiders. Yet, there was still a slender path in the future that held hope. Strange ambassadors. Slowly and with great dignity, Sunspear made his way across Bieltan to the great amphitheatre and took down a delicate mask of porcelain, half laughing, half weeping, from the apex of its archway. As soon as Sunspear had made his way onto the crescent-shaped stage, the mask tumbled from the Autarch's fingers and shattered into 100 shards on the platform below. To the War Council's growing fascination, each of the shards threw up a glittering pillar of light that coalesced into an Eldar warrior dancer. Sunspear knelt before the shimmering figures, relaying Iandan's dilemma and covering Bieltan's recent battle in an archaic form of Eldar language unheard upon the craftworld for centuries. Aid must be given, he said, and swiftly, lest the galaxy face a threat magnified to unstoppable levels. The Harlequin Imagos said not a word, though the real figure at the heart of their great troop bowed elaborately. In a flash of multicolored diamonds, the warrior dancer images shattered apart and vanished back into the shards scattered before the kneeling Autarch. Sunspear rose back to his feet and stated flatly to astonished onlookers that the craft world would prepare for war once more. They were returning to Duel, this time with not one, but 2 allied armies at their side. A deal in the darkness. What infernal bargain was struck on Bieltan's behalf in the dark reaches of the Webway remained shrouded. Yet Sunspear's ploy to use the Harlequins as ambassadors to the Dark City proved extremely effective. Within the space of a single day, the war fleet of Bieltan, taking up position around the Webway portal to Duel, was shadowed by the blade-like attack craft of the Dark Eldar. Contact had been made between the craft worlds and their Cormorite's cousins, snide and caustic at first, but businesslike enough when the matters of Duel's fate came to hand. As tense hours slipped past, a rapport was established between Sunspear and the leader of the Dark Eldar war fleet, the wizened Lord Sarnak, whose permanent grin was unsettling in the extreme. The Archon claimed to be working under the authority of Asdrubal Vecht himself, a fact that was backed up by the many warships in his fleet. Along with a key element of the Cabal of the Black Heart, Sarnak had brought fully half of the infamous witch cult of Strife. It was a formidable boost to Bieltan's chances of victory, yet the real prize of the Harlequins' bargain with the Cormorites was far more exotic. Vex Cabalites possessed a power which Bieltan sought, a device that could utterly destroy a planet. This most potent of weapons took the form of a psychically activated doomsday engine. The fireheart, it was called, a complex nodal resonator capable of causing a planet's molten core to enter violent death throes and send lakes of lava bubbling to the surface. Despite its potency, it was of little use to the Dark Eldar, for they had outlawed the use of psyker-based weaponry long ago, on the grounds that it attracted the attention of their nemesis, Slaanesh. Yet the fireheart was of great value to the craftworlders. With sadistic relish, Lord Sarnak informed the Eldar High Council that, unfortunately, the fireheart device could not be used remotely. A ritual circle of seers would have to activate it planetside and remain there to ensure the correct psychic rites were observed in order to fully destabilize Duel's core. The craftworlders had no choice but to comply. The Eldritch Raiders. The original followers of Prince Iriel, known after his exile as the Eldritch Raiders, fought alongside him during the invasion of Iandan and the battles upon Duel alike. It was Prince Iriel that dealt the death blow to the Trigon, ravaging the peaks of Duel in the climactic battle. The craftworlders' seers would have to ride out the planet's extermination as it unfolded around them, their unavoidable death the price of Duel's certain destruction. Of course, there was no way they could complete their Fireheart's activation without a full-scale military invasion to buy them time. The Archon giggled maniacally as he leered close to the holographic device linking him to Sunspear and his kin. drinking in the dismay of his craft-world cousins as a torturer revels in the breaking of his prey. The price of Duriel's destruction would be great indeed, costing the lives of the craft-world's greatest psychers. Still, the course of the future was set. The swordwind had been gathered, and the fate of Duriel was set in motion. All that remained was to wage war, or so the autarchs thought. Down on the planet's surface, there was a twist in Duriel's fate that even the Farseers had not foreseen. Hidden in the Valley of the Gods, a Webway portal, the most secret of gateways, had been breached. War in the Webway. In their haste to retreat from Duriel and formulate a new attack strategy, the armies of Bieltan had failed to properly seal the blazing portals to the Webway that sat atop the highest of the planet's mountains. The Eldar war host had fought with the fury of Cain to keep the swarms apart. The skies had been cleared above the valleys, and poisonous ichor had spattered down like rain. In their pride, the craft-worlders' armies believed that they had bought themselves time enough to regroup. To the dismay of the War Council, however, there remained a leader beast upon Duriel, powerful and prescient enough to direct the desperate Kraken swarms towards the now defenseless mountaintop portals. After the Bieltan war host had withdrawn, the Tyranid swarms, driven by the psychic imperatives of the Swarm Lord, penetrated the shimmering gateway into the Valley of the Gods. They leapt and scattered in their hundreds through the portals to the labyrinth dimension. Even the rapid intervention of the witch cult of Strife, its raider Gravcraft scrambling to reach the swarm in an attempt to halt the intrusion, was not enough to stem the tide of alien bodies. Despite the blades of the witches and the vicious volleys of darklight and splinter rifles fire leveled at the Tyranid horde, the Dark Eldar war host could not hold them back indefinitely. A great cry of anguish rang out through the Webway's tunnels as the Eldar realized that their sacred realm had been infested. While Bieltan's Farseers held a psychic council of war in preparation for a second strike, the armies of Craftworld Eandon were deployed deep in the reaches of the Webway, making all haste for the front line in the Valador system. As they opened the last few portals between them and their destination, they were met head-on by a ravening swarm of Tyranids. The massed Eldar of Eandon immediately fell back in controlled retreat, unable to fight their way through the wall of crimson carapaced bodies flowing towards them. It was then that Tex Silvereye ordered the advance of the Ghost Warriors. Impervious to the claws and talons of Kraken's beast, the statuesque constructs of the Eandon warhost formed a wall of wraithbone that plugged the tunnels one by one around the Godspeak's Webway gate. Roaring carnifexes that had bullied their way into the Webway's tunnels smashed the Wraith Guard apart before being destroyed in their turn by the Wraith Knights that stooped through the glowing tunnels. Yet it was the emergence of the heroes of Eldar legend that saw the tide turn. Led by Eandon's own avatar, and bolstered by the High Council of Eandon, all 6 of the fabled Felix Lords vaulted and sprang from spar to shattered spar. Every slicing shuriken and pinpoint thrust took a Tyranid life. Morgan Ra mowed down scores of Gaunts with his great battle scythe, the Morgatar. Janazar dueled deftly with a pair of Hive Tyrants, and Baharoth blinded carnifexes one after another, allowing Fugan to incinerate the beast with his burning lance. Slowly, inevitably, the invading Tyranids were pushed back. The grand war host of Eandon trampled their bodies to emerge triumphant onto Duriel's peaks. The final battle was just beginning. The fireheart awoken. When the Eldar of Bieltan returned to Duriel, a pang of pure sorrow flared in their hearts. The planet bore as much resemblance to its former beauty as a flayed skull did to the face of a lovely maiden. It had been systematically stripped bare of all life, that is, save the Tyranid invaders themselves. Bubbling, tentacle-fringed digestion pools scarred the surfaces like open sores. A massed spore beast belched alien foulness into the air. Eater swarms from both high fleets roamed the valleys, seizing the last scraps of biomass from the planet's crust before plunging bodily into the digestion pools. Left to their own devices, the larger warrior beasts of the high fleets fought amongst themselves, slaves to their baser instincts now that Duriel's conquest was complete. In the middle distance, a thin forest of swaying mouthparts quested for earthbound capillary towers, their ribbed lengths vanishing into the heavens. From afar, they looked like the tentacles of some celestial sea monster hunting for prey. Ortak Sunspear knew that the bioship tendrils were beyond his reach. Each mouthpart was wide enough to accommodate a grav tank in its serpentine gullet, and the swarms that surrounded them would fight like crazed beasts in their defense. The Eldar had hours at best to stop the red-tinged digestion pools that dotted the valleys from being drained by the probing tendrils high above. The absorption process had begun. The Spear of Cain. As Ortak Sunspear surveyed the dismal landscape of what had once been Duel, the disembodied voices of his roaming Viper pilots whispered in his ear. A highly unusual point of conflict had been located several leagues to the north. The Outriders had found a trail of Tyranid corpses that led to a seething mound of purple chitin. The Viper pilots requested Sunspear's advice on how to proceed. Wasting no time, the Ortak requisitioned a nearby falcon and took to the spore-choked skies. As Sunspear's sleek grav tank led a formation of Eldar skimmers over the hellish landscape, he dimly perceived a burning red glow at the heart of the mound of Tyranid dead to the north. Sunspear gave a shout of elation. He could clearly make out the raging avatar of Beotan amongst the horde, oozing molten from a dozen wounds, but still fighting with the fury of Cain himself. The mighty Suin Dale, known as the Wailing Doom, burst from the chest of a rearing warlock even as his bloody hand crushed the head of a Tyranid warrior with a wet pop. Here was the supremacy of the Eldar writ large. Here was where they would make their stand. At Sunspear's command, the armies of Beotan hurtled down from the Godspeak towards the avatar of their warrior god. Disembarking atop the mount of alien corpses, the great host of aspect warriors raised their voices in a fierce war shout and prepared to buy their seers the time they needed to activate the fireheart. The Farseers, hurrying from the cavernous holds of the Naird-class cruiser Vol's Caress, bade their escort carry the fireheart to the thinnest part of Duel's crust. Scant minutes later, the nodal core of the ancient device began to pulse a deep red. Subsonics thrummed through the parched earth under their feet, and the seers were not the only warriors to emerge from the Caress. Unfolding themselves from the largest cargo bays were giants born only for war. A phantom titan reared up to its full height, its noble head reaching the spore clouds as its ancestral colors shimmered under protective hollow fields. At its flanks strode a pair of revenant titans, twin engines of destruction. The trio of war machines moved with a fluidity that belied their size, striding into formation with the practiced ease of the aspect warriors below. Zooming past the shoulders of the magnificent titans came bladed dark Eldar gravcraft and flocks of murderous scourges, appearing to the craft-worlders much like black-winged vultures whirring in search of their next meal. In their wake came a host of brightly patterned venoms, their fluttering pennants proclaiming the glory of the laughing god. Atop the Godspeak, the Webway portal burned bright as unit after unit of Eldar took up formation, weapons ready and eyes glazing with the need for vengeance. No matter the cost, the fireheart would be activated, and Duel would suffer a fiery and violent end. The final battle. The precision and speed of the Eldar attack was military work of art. It took several minutes before the alien hordes became truly aware of the scale of the threat assailing them. Yet, as knowledge of the Eldar's presence flowed through the synapse creatures of the swarm, the sea of Tyranids recoiled and bunched up, readying for an assault of unprecedented size. With the fury of a predator that had been cheated of its prey, the swarm screeched as one and plunged towards the Eldar massing on the Godspeak Valley. And High Fleet Leviathan's attack was terrifying in its intensity. Lumbering packs of carnifexes bulldozed their way across the corpse fields, charging headlong into a storm of shuriken catapult fire to crush straight through the aspect warriors that moved to stop them, and then into the ranks of Eldar guardians behind. In their wake came massive Tyranid gun beasts, their symbiotic weapons hurling vile salvos into the air as the Dark Eldar carved through the skies above. Harlequins wove a deadly dance with a horde of gene stealers that lapped around the Eldar flank, the ground below the combatants saturated with blood. To the south, a trio of hive tyrants marched with deadly intent towards the Eldar warhost, the living shields of their escorts protecting them from the worst punishments meted out by close-knit shining spear squadrons that zoomed as fast as the eye could follow. On the slopes, gladiatorial teams of witches eviscerated squat-bodied brood beasts, and succubi matched their peerless agility against the sheer ferocity of the serpentine raveners that burst from the ground under their feet. To the east, the ground trembled as a gigantic hierophant stalked from the forest of capillary towers, stabbing its way towards the Eldar army's position with menace in every step. The phantom titan that had debarked from the Caress and its revenant escort leapt from the rear echelons to engage the beast with pulsar and sonic lance, each shot boring a hole straight through the monstrosity. In answer, the bio-titan roared and fired a volley of burning biological gunk, coating one of the revenants from head to foot and boiling away its systems until it toppled backwards into the dirt. Revenge of the lost. The battle raged on, a stalemate at first, though the corpse count rose high on both sides. As yet more Tyranids joined the fray, the odds were stacked further against the swordwind and its allies. Two sun spears mounting unease, broods from within Leviathan and Kraken were boiling out of the foothills of the Godspeak and falling upon the Guardian warhost that sought to protect the Farseer Council as they awakened the fireheart device. The attack was as sudden as it was unexpected, for the devious tendrils of the Kraken splinter fleet had waited for a gap to emerge in the Eldar battle line and then darted forth with all the fury they could muster. There was simply no time to reinforce the Guardian host. Every one of the Eldar and their allies were fighting at close quarters against Tyranids of every conceivable kind. The situation was dire indeed, for if the fireheart was disrupted, then all would be for naught. Though the Guardian warhost was holding back the vanguard of the swarm with focused shuriken fire, it had little hope of stopping the leader beast that coordinated the assault. The giant hive tyrant stormed headlong into the Eldar ranks, its four glimmering bone swords carving apart any brave enough to bar its path. Nerves aflame, the Farseers beneath its gaze began to falter in their psychic activation ritual. Only the strident voice of Tex Silvereye kept their focus intact. Just as the hive tyrant loomed too close to stop, swirling holes in the fabric of reality opened like irises within its body, ripping the creature apart in explosions of ichor. The ghost warriors of Iyanden stalked from the Godspeak Webway portal towards the beleaguered swordwind, their wraith cannons ripping apart the largest Tyranids, whilst the distortion size of speeding Hemlock wraith fighters snuffed out the lesser gun beasts by the score. Wraith lords strode confidently into the Tyranid warriors that were coordinating the assault on the valley, slashing their ghost glaives left and right. The elegant wraith knights in their wake sniped the remaining synapse creatures with controlled blasts from sun cannons and heavy wraith cannons. Screeching gargoyles flapped and clawed at the ghost constructs, but to no avail. Their statuesque physiques were so indomitable, and their senses so far removed from the mortal plane, that the Tyranids proved little more hindrance than a cloud of moths to a hunter. The arrival of Ianden's warhost had bought the Farseers time to complete the Fireheart's activation. As the physically charged nodes of the device glowed a fierce red, the surface of the planet trembled and began to split open. Superheated steam vented from 1,000 fissures as columns of lava soared skywards, and Duel screamed in protest. The battle in the valley, already on the brink of madness, boiled over into pure mayhem. As the ground shattered into shifting, crackling plates, massed broods of Tyranids were tipped into the red-hot molten rock that rose unstoppably underfoot. The hissing of their demise sounded like rain on a hot steel plate as the fires of Duel consumed them whole. The Godpeak speaks. The air had filled with smoke and screams, yet instead of panic and withdrawal, the Tyranid broods redoubled their assault. Those Eldar still planetside were forced to fight with every ounce of fury they could muster, invoking Cain to give them strength and springing across the gaps that opened wide in the planet's crust. Not all were successful. Whole chunks of the surface were breaking up and dissolving in the rising lava that gushed from each new wound, pitching aspect warriors and Tyranids alike into the cleansing fires. The god peak itself shook mightily before its cap burst open in a titanic triple pillar of white-hot lava, an immense pyroclastic cloud billowing out in all directions to consume the warriors on its flanks. The Craftworlder's dark Eldar allies hurtled through the skies as the fireheart device worked its ancient magics below, pausing in their escape only to subdue the larger Tyranid beasts in a storm of blades and herd their recumbent forms into the runic hex cages that hung from their raider transports. Cries of despair floated up from the lava as hundreds of embattled Eldar were dissolved in the planet's lifeblood, a macabre mockery of the Tyranid digestion cycle that had been broken open by this forced catastrophe. All around was confusion and terror. Even the bioships in orbit above seemed to know that destruction was at hand, for the ribbed capillary tubes were rising fast, sucking up their gruesome harvest with desperate vigor. Autarch Sunspear cried out in dismay as he watched High Fleet Leviathan's probing tunnels latch onto the digestion pools filled with High Fleet Kraken's ruddy biomass. The capillary towers began to funnel the acidic gruel to the bioships with great peristaltic pulses. The Eldar had failed at the last hurdle. The tentacled monstrosities of the High Fleets needed only a small sample of the mingled biomass to birth a new race of supernaturally advanced bioconstructs. So, despite the Eldar's best efforts to stop them, the Tyranids had snatched their prize from the fires of defeat. The Twisted Strike. Just as Sunspear's heart felt like it was about to turn to cold stone, the roaring thunderclap of supersonic aircraft boomed overhead. The Autarch could just make out the ragged, sickle-winged shapes of razor-wing fighter squadrons hurtling through the skies overhead, the edges of their wings limed with the flicker of monomolecular fields. His eyes widened as the razor-wings darted at incredible speed through the storms of magma and shot towards the capillary towers that were draining the planet dry. Rather than avoiding the great muscled tubes, the jet fighters used their aircraft to carve through the capillary towers one by one, placing their winged blades with such expert precision that the liquid feast being sucked into the bioships sputtered out like blood from severed arteries. The variegated tubes of the capillary towers toppled downwards, their precious liquid cargo gushing in all directions from the severed stumps. Sunspear laughed with disbelief and astonishment. The bioships of Hive Leviathan had been cheated of their ugly feast after all, and with Duel falling apart beneath them, they had no hope of reclaiming it. The Red Death of Duel. His mission complete, Autarch Sunspear withdrew his forces as best he could, as the thorn-patterned gravcraft of the swordwind hurtled skywards towards Val's caress. News of the wider battle reached him. Craftworld Eyandan's contribution to the battle for Duel had not been confined to the battle planetside. Prince Iriel, the Grand Admiral of Eyandan's fleet, had coordinated his twin armada of spacecraft on a seemingly suicidal attack run against the splinter fleet of High Fleet Kraken. After his victories at Eyandan, he knew well how to slay the Tyranid monstrosities and instructed his commanders accordingly. Though it cost him the better part of his fleet, Iriel's Eldritch Raiders and the Eyandan Armada ensured the destruction of each and every one of Kraken's bioships before escaping, as Leviathan began to close in. In their death throes, the Splinter Fleet's bioships expelled yet more organisms towards Duel's surface, but their deadly cargoes died in a sea of lava as soon as they reached the shattered crust. The Splinter Fleet had been slain. The doomed planet of Duel had been led to ruin by the Imperium and brought to the edge of destruction by the High Fleets that followed it. Yet, it had been the sons of Cain who had pushed it over the edge. The last of the Eldar left upon the ill-fated world were the Farseers of Bultan, still channeling their psychic power into the fireheart whilst the air itself ignited, incinerating everything upon its surface. As the Eldar fleet fled into the safety of anonymous space, they left behind them a burning world akin to a miniature sun. A lambent flame fanned briefly into a raging inferno before being extinguished forever. Meditating in his chambers on the Val's caress, Autarch Sunspear prayed to the Eldar gods of old. The Duriel's fate was not a metaphor for that of the entire race. No one answered. Deep in the bowels, the ebon sting. Deep in the bowels of Cormorah, the succubus, Leth Hesperax, presented her newest prize to the homunculi of the ebon sting coven. Her witches brought forth 6 great hex cages full of spite, hissing Tyranid warrior organisms, 3 sets with crimson carapace, and the other 3 armoured in the deep purple of a livid bruise. After lengthy examination, the homunculi assured her that the beasts could indeed be fused into a single strain, and that the coven's breeding vats were up to the task. The resultant menagerie of weapon beasts would be the talk of Cormorah's gladiatorial arenas for some time to come. The regally dressed harlequin at Hesperax's side chuckled quietly, blowing a theatrical kiss towards the succubus before bowing deeply and vanishing into the shadows. Preparations had to be made, after all. The great game never stopped for long. Warzone Damocles. Year 999, Millennium 41. The Damocles Gulf. Total war across the frontier. For more than 250 years, the region of space near the Damocles Gulf has been a source of bitter dispute between 2 empires, the indomitable Imperium of mankind and that of the vigorous alien race known as the Tau. Despite an uneasy truce developing in the wake of the Damocles Crusade, war now rages anew as the Tau begin their next phase of conquest. A sector in flames. The Imperial worlds beyond the Damocles Gulf were once again embroiled by war. Echoing their second phase expansion more than 2 centuries earlier, the Tau Empire surged into Imperial space on a sector-wide front. They offered mercy to worlds that welcomed the teachings of the greater good, but a swift death to those that opposed them. The Tau Empire was in ascendancy, and nothing, it seemed, could keep them from fulfilling their destiny. The Imperium, despite its impossibly numerous armies, was ill prepared to deal with the suddenness and strength of the Tau invasion. Many of the Imperial forces, once stationed to defend the Damocles Gulf, had been withdrawn to fight another, more pressing threat in the form of an encroaching Tyranid hive fleet. In this manner, the Tau offensive could not have been timed better, and they made swift progress deep into Imperial space. The Imperium's remaining armies were forced to retreat to their garrison worlds and fortify them as best they could. The rapidity of the Tau advance was abetted by many Imperial worlds that were sympathetic to the Tau's beliefs. The legacy of water-caste diplomats who had long been preparing the way for the Third Sphere expansion. So successful were these ambassadors that some worlds capitulated without even firing a shot, welcoming the Tau as saviors, not invaders. A new era of expansion. This new war against the Imperium began when, in the year 997, Millennium 41, the Tau Empire launched its Third Sphere expansion. The revered leader of their race, the venerable Orgvayr, decreed that their strength was great enough to expand the borders of their burgeoning empire once more. Never before had the Tau wielded such military might, and the confidence of this ambitious race was at an all-time high. But their self-assurance was well justified, for the Tau Empire was as large and as powerful as it had ever been. Working as one for the greater good, the Tau Empire's entire population was placed on a total war footing. The Firecast in its entirety prepared to set forth on great transports to distant battlefields. The Tau were further augmented by millions of alien auxiliaries that had already been subsumed into the Tau Empire, all ready to do their part in helping to expand its boundaries. Hundreds of expeditionary forces set out in every direction from the Tau-sept worlds, each explicitly tasked with the assimilation or subjugation of a chain of star systems deemed desirable by advanced scouts and long-distance surveillance drones. With all four castes working in precise harmony and driven ever onwards by their ethereal leaders, the Tau Empire expanded at an incredible rate. Within the first year, several potential sept worlds had already been established, wrested from orc warlords or other Xenos species, and colonized within weeks of conquest. But, inevitably, it was against the Imperium of Man that the Tau were to face their greatest challenge. Indeed, Orgvayr was well aware of the threat posed by mankind, for Imperial retaliation in the wake of the Tau's second sphere expansion had taught him much about the dangers of rousing this sleeping giant. The Firecast had learned a fearful lesson during the bloody reprisals of the Imperium's Damocles crusade. So it was that Orgvayr chose to personally oversee the expeditionary force that was to force a passage into Imperial territory through the narrow route spanning the Damocles Gulf. Orgvayr would not be alone in his venture. At his side was the most brilliant military strategist of her time, Commander Shadowsun. Named as the replacement for the traitor Farsight, Shadowsun now bore the mantle of Supreme Commander of the Tau Firecast. Having earned much fame and renown for her actions against the Greenskins during the Great War of Confederation, Shadowsun was now a famous hero of the Tau Empire and a worthy successor to her mentor, the legendary Commander Puretide. Propelled at ever greater speeds by the latest Earthcast impulse reactors, the vast armada of Orgvayr's Tau coalition powered across the Damocles Gulf and into Imperial space. The expeditionary force met little in the way of significant opposition, even from the Imperial worlds that rejected the offers of the Watercast ambassadors. Despite their defiance, resistant worlds soon fell prey to Shadowsun's tactical genius and the dedication of her Firecast warriors. Vastly outgunned by the pinnacle of Tau weapons technology and overmatched by the aerial dominance, the meager Imperial forces that defended these outlying planets offered little more than sport for Shadowsun's veterans of the Orc Wars. Spurred ever onwards by the ethereal Supreme at their head, world after world fell to the Tau in a series of precision strikes. Time and again, Shadowsun's rapid insertion forces, elite formations comprising multiple battlesuit teams, were deployed from low orbit to circumnavigate the hastily prepared defenses and annihilate the foe wholesale. The small mining world of Thelian IV was conquered in less than 12 hours by the relentless attacks of 100 hunter cadres. The densely populated hive world of Jorvax fell even faster. After witnessing the arrival of the overwhelming Tau forces, Planetary Governor Balsius IV called for his commanders to stand down, surrendering without a shot being fired. Even as the conquest of the planets beyond the Damocles Gulf continued in earnest, ambassadors from the Watercast were making equally impressive gains. Their battlefield, however, was on the negotiating table, swaying the hearts and minds of disenfranchised populations and resentful planetary governors. Many of these worlds wasted no time in rejoining the Tau Empire, just as they had done during the Second Sphere expansion. However, as astropathic warnings and pleas for military aid gradually began to circulate around the Imperial worlds of the subsector, the persuasive methods of the Watercast became increasingly ineffective. The further these emissaries of the greater good advanced into Imperial territory ahead of the Tau expeditionary forces, the more likely they were to be rebuffed or face persecution. When a Tau ambassadorial ship landed on the night world of Voltores, the water-caste diplomats on board duly presented themselves at the gates of Furion Peak, towering stronghold of House Terrin. As the ruler of a knightly house, Patriarch Tybalt was honor-bound to invite the heralds in to present themselves and say their piece. He listened patiently as the alien orators spanned tales of peaceful relations between species and the harmony which the greater good would bring to an otherwise barbaric galaxy. But Tybalt knew that, behind their silky words, the Xenos ambassadors offered a simple choice. Give fealty to the Tau Empire, or be destroyed. The suggestion that Tybalt should betray his oath of loyalty was an insult to his honor, and when the Tau diplomats finished speaking, Tybalt rose to his feet and vehemently denounced them for their lies, banishing them from Voltores under pain of death. As the emissaries hastily left, the Patriarch roared a mighty oath that House Terrin would oppose the impudent Xenos of the Tau Empire should they ever threaten the sovereignty of a world that belonged to the Emperor, a vow that cost the Tau dearly in the ensuing months. The gravity of the Tau expansion was not lost on the Imperial commanders of the Lithesh sector. Indeed, it was becoming increasingly evident that the Xenos forces were far greater in both number and strength than they had been during their Second Sphere expansion 2 centuries earlier. Slowly, inexorably, the Imperium began to gather its armies in response to the Tau threat, though it would still take time before a force large enough to counter the alien advance could be fully mustered. With the exception of a few swiftly mobilized vanguard formations, the Imperium's defenders were on their own. With memories of the overwhelming victories won at the outset of the Damocles Crusade fresh in their minds, the Imperium's commanders grossly underestimated the Tau. Their arrogance only served to leave the Emperor's armies further at the mercy of Shadowsun's finely honed military strategies. It was only when the first wave of Imperial reinforcements arrived that the Tau were forced to adapt the tactics that, thus far, had proven so efficient. So were the Imperium's embattled defenders bolstered, at the last, by the White Scar's 3rd Company, the Katajan's 2nd Green Vipers, and Patriarch Tybalt, at the head of 5 household detachments of his knights. The northernmost region beyond the Damocles Gulf was now fully under Tau control, and a number of new sept worlds were already being established in key systems. Further to the galactic west lay the mineral-rich Dovar system, the primary objective of Anvar's expeditionary force. With the Imperium's defenders having retracted to their most heavily defended worlds, protocols of engagement would normally have called for the Tau expeditionary force to circumnavigate the populous hive world of Agralan and concentrate on the more vulnerable planets beyond. However, the Dovar system's proximity to an impossible region of the Damocles Gulf meant that it was all but impossible for the Tau Armada to gain access to it without passing through Agralan's orbit. The hive world had to fall. To prepare for the unavoidable assault on Agralan, Commander Shadowsun cunningly distracted the other nearby human worlds to keep their defenders occupied. Hunter cadres fought hit-and-run skirmishes, supported by huge numbers of specialist DroneNet VX-10 formations. This shrewd use of expendable drones freed Shadowsun to muster the better part of her force to attack Agralan. As Shadowsun's armada powered towards Agralan, huge rents were torn in the fabric of reality as a handful of Imperial Navy vessels burst from the warp. With the Tau having revealed their next target, the Imperium's reinforcements were able to use the superior speed of their warp drives to get the jump on the Tau fleet. A ferocious space battle ensued, and though the small Imperial flotilla was hugely outmatched and soon forced to disengage, 3 vessels were able to slip away in the confusion and deliver their valuable cargo to the planet's surface. So did the White Scars, Catachans, and Imperial Knights arrive on Agralan just in time to face the Tau planetary assault. Agralan's orbital defences, though formidable, could not withstand the might of the Tau fleet. In a few hours, their guns had been silenced by wave after wave of sleek Xenos fighters, and Agralan lay open to attack. But the planet's surface represented an entirely different challenge to the Tau expeditionary force. Each high city was defended by towering ferrocrete walls, bristling with colossal guns that covered carefully prepared killing zones. Beyond these mighty bulwarks lay entire fields of graphitic mines designed to channel enemies into deadly crossfires. Even the planet itself was capable of killing the unwary. A virus bomb had long ago permanently scarred its surface in an Inquisition-sanctioned exterminatus, following a demon incursion that even the Ordo Malleus could not contain. However, in the aftermath of the virus bomb's deployment, a unique element in Agralan's atmosphere reacted unexpectedly with the fallout from the attack, creating an environment so toxic that it became incredibly hazardous to live outside of the rebuilt hive cities and their air reclamators. To make matters worse, the veil between reality and the warp remained incredibly thin in the aftermath of the demonic attack. Mutated flora and the taint of chaos were commonplace beyond the sanctuary of the wars. Such a history of violence had led the inhabitants of Agralan to heavily fortify their high cities, and the Inquisition had remained vigilant should the demons ever return. Into this crucible of hostility swept the Tau, their fearless commander the first to set foot on Agralan's surface. Shadowsun, ever the patient huntress, sought to test her enemies rather than waste the lives of her brave warriors in a bloody assault on the imposing defences. Orbital scans had revealed the presence of a small force of the Imperium's deadly Space Marines, alongside a number of Imperial Knights, against which the Firecast had not yet been tested. Shadowsun wanted to study this formidable new foe in battle, and, if the opportunity presented itself, destroy them before launching her main offensive on Agralan. In order to draw out and expose the Knights, Shadowsun's formations probed the defences of high cities across the planet's surface, stretching the Imperial forces to their limit. So effective were Shadowsun's hit-and-run tactics that, had it not been for the Herculean efforts of the White Scars, it is certain that the three high cities of the Acacian Basin would have fallen in spite of their great walls. In response, and in order to deny the White Scars their swiftest means of transportation, Shadowsun ordered Tau air superiority wings to hunt the White Scars' Thunderhawk gunships whenever they took to the skies. Only the noble sacrifice of their accompanying Storm Talon squadrons kept any of the invaluable Thunderhawks operational. With the Imperial forces woefully outmatched in the air, the White Scars commander, Khosaro Khan, was forced to deploy half his company's transports as an armoured vanguard to act as a mobile reserve. Meanwhile, Shadowsun positioned the majority of her heaviest weaponry around the capital hive, Agralan Prime, using a Kaon ploy to draw the Imperial Knights stationed there out into the open. Such tempting bait was too much for Patriarch Tybalt and the Knights of House Terran, and they duly sallied forth to engage their foe. However, the moment they left the city walls, the Knights were targeted by carefully concealed hammerhead interdiction and range support cadres. Scores of hyper-velocity railgun shots slammed home. The Tau were, as yet, unaware of the effectiveness of the Knights' ion shields, and only one succumbed to the fusillade. Within moments, the Knights were in amongst the Tau armor with devastating effect. Only the personal intervention of Shadowsun, at the head of a Firestrike Assault Hunter cadre, forced the Knights to withdraw. As the White Scars master of the hunt, Khosaro Khan had hunted and slain many powerful enemy warlords, returning to Chogoris with their heads amid great ceremony. In undertaking these quests, The Khan had become well versed in reading the tactics employed by his enemies in order to identify the presence of such a quarry. In Commander Shadowsun, he soon recognized a worthy foe. More specifically, a foe whose death would greatly undermine the Tau forces fighting on Agralan. So did the Khan swear a great oath to see her slain. Leaving the defense of Agralan to a war council led by Patriarch Tybalt and the Katajan Colonel Strachan, Khan led a bike-mounted demi-company to track down the Tau commander. As they roared off to wage war behind enemy lines, an optimized stealth group doing advanced reconnaissance brought word of his change of tactics directly to Shadowsun. Forewarned against the threat posed by the White Scars that hunted her, Shadowsun reacted with her typical composure and tactical pragmatism. Rather than seeking refuge from her pursuers, she planned to use the dogged determination of the Space Marines, a trait which they had frequently displayed during the bitter fighting of the Damocles Crusade, against them. Though the White Scars caused great harm to the Tau infrastructure with their lightning raids, more often than not, they were unwittingly drawn towards battlefields of Shadowsun's choosing. In the battle for Blackshale Ridge, Shadowsun even offered herself as bait to provoke the White Scars into springing a trap. Surrounded on all sides and taking heavy fire, Khosrow Khan and his fellow White Scars would have been cut off and annihilated, were it not for the timely arrival of Landspeeder Stormbringer Squadron, which was able to punch an escape route through the encircling Tau army. Far from sitting idle and waiting for the White Scars to make their next move, Shadowsun had been working with Orgvayr, preparing to unleash her boldest action yet of the Third Sphere expansion. In order to prevent the war on Agralan from descending into a grinding stalemate, she intended to marshal her forces and launch a carefully orchestrated simultaneous attack against every hive on the planet. To combat the Imperial Knights, the attack on Agralan Prime would be spearheaded by the latest breakthrough in Earthcast technology, the XV-104 Riptide Battlesuit. If Shadowsun's ambitious strategy worked, Agralan would fall in a single day. As the White Scars gathered at a hidden munitions cache, a lone figure emerged from the darkness. It was Shadow Captain Shrike of the Raven Guard, and he delivered a message to the alerted White Scars from his chapter master, Corvin Severax. The White Scars were to return to the capital and prepare to retreat off-world. A powerful Imperial fleet, including the Raven Guard battle barge Wings of Deliverance, stood ready to aid in the evacuation. Agralan could no longer be held against the Tau. The fall of Agralan. It was well indeed for the Imperium that Corvin Severax had such a shrewd tactical mind. Had he not acted so swiftly and decisively to organize a full-scale evacuation, the planet-wide Tau assault would have decimated the Imperium's fighting strength in the Lethesh sector. When the Tau attack came, it was so sudden and brutally efficient that many high cities fell within the first few hours of the mass assault. The defenses of every high city had been meticulously analyzed by orbital scans and advanced reconnaissance teams. The weaknesses of each of these strongholds had been discovered, and the appropriate cadres deployed to ensure their total destruction. Shadowsun developed a different plan of attack for each hive city, ensuring that if any defensive strategy proved effective, it would not work against Tau forces elsewhere. In Gorvus Hive, the Hydra batteries that protected the city from aerial assault were eliminated by optimized stealth groups. Within the hour, the defenses had been bombed to rubble by wave after wave of Paradox squadrons. Meanwhile, in Immortus Hive, 10 range support cadres concentrated their railgun fire to level a section of the outer wall. Hunter cadres by the dozen poured out of their devilfish transports to storm the breach, and soon the high city streets ran red with the blood of the slain. At the forefront of each and every assault strode the new XV-104 Riptides. Wherever these mighty battlesuits engaged the beleaguered Imperial defenders, they slaughtered them and shattered their bulwarks. Only the Imperial Knights seemed able to withstand them on the battlefield, and even then, 5 knights were felled by Riptide wings during the battle for Agralan Prime. The battle for the capital hive saw the greatest concentration of both Imperial and Tau forces engage in the heaviest fighting of the war. It was here that Commander Shadowsun led her fire-strike assault cadre into the fray, urged on in person by Orgvayr and his ethereal council. Inspired by the legends in their midst, the Firecast fought all the harder. The defenders of Agralan Prime had been bolstered overnight by the newly arrived Raven Guard 6th Company and the Cadian 724th Wardens under Colonel Jericho Voss. Corvin Severax himself directed the Hive City's defences, determined to see them hold long enough for Shrike and the White Scars to fight their way back into the city for extraction. There were moments of incredible skill and heroism on both sides. During the course of the battle, the marksmanship of Magog's rattling rifles accounted for no less than 30 crisis battlesuits. Meanwhile, the famous Tau Hammerhead commander, Longstrike, reaped a fearful tally of battle tanks before the city gates and crippled a pair of Imperial Knights. Beyond the southern walls of the capital, Straken's Catachan jungle fighters engaged in savage ambush and counter-ambush against Kroot hunting packs amid the desiccated woodlands beyond the hive walls. It was here that Shrike led the White Scars on their route towards the city. The arrival of the Space Marines and a pair of Hailstorm squadrons from the Hive City soon saw the Kroot mercenaries defeated. Having forged a clear path through the Tau lines, the Imperial forces retreated back towards the relative safety of the city. Just when it seemed that the Space Marines and Catachans would make it back to Agralan Prime, Shadowsun sprung her trap. A simultaneous pincer assault comprising 4 counter-strike cadres and Shadowsun's own fire-strike assault cadre slammed into both flanks of the Imperial column. Despite a ferocious counterattack from the White Scars and Raven Guard, driving the first wave of Tau attackers back, the arrival of a Riptide wing turned the tide back against them. Shadowsun darted between the desperate firefights, picking off the Imperial transports with methodical efficiency. It was at that moment, just when all appeared lost, that Corvin Severax played his trump card. The explosive arrival of this new combatant was evidenced when a vast chain blade burst from the chest of a Riptide, before tearing the battlesuit apart in a welter of sparks. The Obsidian Knights had entered the fray. Acutely aware of the specialist skills of this fabled knight, Severax had sought out the relentless Tau killer and transported him to Agralan. The violence that ensued proved the chapter master wise, for the Obsidian Knights slaughtered the Tau forces with terrible purpose. Inspired by this veritable engine of death, the embattled Space Marines redoubled their efforts and hurled the Tau back. At the last, the Knights of House Terran were able to fight their way through to relieve the retreating Imperial host. There, the Knight Paladins stood sentinel, bombarding the Tau with their rapid-fire battle cannons, as the Catachans and Space Marines reached the Hive City at last. The Knights suffered for their brave rearguard action, the Tau broadsides, hammerheads, and Riptide battlesuits making them pay dearly. Only when the first of the Imperial transports were launched did Patriarch Tybalt grudgingly lead his few remaining knights back towards the awaiting Imperial dropships. With that final act, the Imperium withdrew from Agralan, leaving the planet in Tau hands. Shadowsun's planet-wide assault had proven to be a tactical masterstroke. In a single day, the Imperial forces had been humbled, and every high city had been taken. Within hours of the Imperial fleet breaking orbit, work had already begun to settle this newest Tau-Sept world, which would be named Mugulath Bay. The Imperium regroups. After the defeat at Agralan, Corvin Severax held a council of war aboard his flagship Wings of Deliverance. It was here that Patriarch Tybalt made a solemn gesture of sacrifice, offering up his own homeworld as a favourable battleground on which they could fight the Tau. After many long decisions, all were in agreement that the Imperial fleet would withdraw to nearby Voltores. If the Tau could be drawn into attacking this verdant night world, it could be defended more effectively than any other world in the sector. The key to the strategy was the fact that the planet's only populated area was centered around the mighty stronghold of House Terran, Furion Peak. If the Tau were to conquer Voltores, they would have to attack the fortress directly. The Imperial forces could thus muster their strength in a single location. The galactic location of Voltores had kept the planet largely isolated from the many wars fought over the millennia by the Imperium and the knights of the planet's ruling house. But in 980999 Millennium 41, that was all about to change. In the wake of her stunning victory at Agralan, Shadowsun led her Tau expeditionary fleet onwards to fresh conquests without delay, adhering to the sage axiom of her late mentor, Commander Puretide. The Devore system now lay open to the Tau, and Shadowsun's forces swept through the planets of the region in swift succession. Yet Shadowsun had her doubts. Ever in the back of her mind was what had become of the Imperial forces that had eluded her at Agralan. Though he knew she would never admit it, Orgvayr could sense Shadowsun's frustration and determined to ease her state of mind. So did the Ethereal Supreme grant Shadowsun sanction to leave and hunt down her quarry while the rest of the expeditionary force consolidated their conquest of the Dovar system. Not only would their destruction shatter Imperial resistance in the sector, but Orgvayr was confident that after fulfilling her quest, Shadowsun would return to him more hungry than ever to expand the Tau Empire and strike deeper into the heart of the Imperium. Setting forth with fully half of the Tau Coalition's military strength behind her, Shadowsun wasted no time in tracking down the whereabouts of the Imperial host, sending out surveillance drones in their thousands to seek her prey. It was not long before she had discovered their location, for Voltores was close, and the Imperial forces stationed there had made no effort to conceal their presence. Shadowsun gave the order to head for Voltores without hesitation. When the Tau fleet arrived at Voltores, Shadowsun was surprised to find the planet's orbit was not held against them. Despite system-wide scans revealing that an Imperial fleet was indeed present nearby, it soon became apparent that it had no intention of engaging the much larger Tau Armada. Cautious of the danger, but fully confident in the superior strength and number of ships under her command, Shadowsun chose to press on with the attack on Voltores. A few hours later, the Tau fleet was in position and ready to commence the invasion of the Night World. Corvin Severax had ordered the Imperial fleet to retreat before the Tau Armada, feigning weakness. He needed to ensure that Voltores was a suitably irresistible target to the pursuing Tau, who now had the perfect opportunity to seek revenge on the knights that had so vehemently rebuked their ambassadors and caused so much harm on Agralan. House Terran would not stand alone. Their stronghold of Furion Peak stood proud atop a rocky plateau that pierced the jungle canopy, and it was there that the Imperium would make its stand. With great effort, the White Scar Stormseer, Sudabe, had concealed the main fighting strength of the Raven Guard beneath a shadowy psychic mist. Meanwhile, the Catachans were carefully ensconced within the dense jungle surrounding Furion Peak. Even the dangerous predators that stalked amongst them held no fear for those born and raised on Catachan. The duty of bait went to the brave shock troops of the Cadian 724th, yet even they were heavily dug in before the great gates of Furion Peak. Within the stronghold itself waited the sharpest jaws of the trap. Khosaro Khan's third company, and the full fighting strength of House Terran's knights. Shadowsun had carefully reviewed the force disposition arrayed against her on the planet's surface. All of the Imperial strength was concentrated in one location, around a solitary fortress. She was, however, well aware that the enemy formations were visible to the Armada's orbital scanners could not represent all of the Imperial forces that had escaped Agralan. This meant that any reserves were either stationed inside the enemy stronghold itself, or remained aboard their fleeing ships and planned to leave the planet to its fate. To Shadowsun's well-honed instincts, such a situation called for Montkar, the killing blow. She would launch a lightning assault to crush the exposed enemy with overwhelming force. Counter-strike cadres and rapid insertion forces would form a hard-hitting reserve, ready to react to any fresh enemy threats yet to be revealed. If she could conquer an entire Imperial hive world in a single day, what hope did one enemy fortress have? For the first time in her illustrious career, Shadowsun was sorely mistaken. Blinded by her determination to eliminate those who had previously eluded her, Shadowsun had fallen for the same strategy that had won her victories beyond counting. Lured into launching an all-out attack on the Imperial battle line, Shadowsun realized too late the sheer size and strength of the Imperial army lying in wait. The Tau cadres swept towards Furion Peak, preparing to smash the Imperial army aside with a single crushing blow. Shadowsun led from the front, embodying the tip of the spear that would deliver the killing blow. A series of distant illuminations was all the warning the first wave of Tau cadres received, before explosions suddenly bloomed amidst their lines. The heavy ordnance blasted apart armor, flesh and bone with equal impunity. Carefully concealed direct support batteries had been dug into the flanks of the stronghold's foothills, and they proceeded to bombard the onrushing Tau with increasing ferocity as they drew nearer. As soon as the first shells crashed down, the Catachans swarmed forth from the jungle thickets and began to pour fire into the flanks of the Tau advance. The disciplined Fire Tau warriors reacted swiftly to these multiple new threats, rallying around their mighty riptides and returning fire, seemingly impervious to the seismic explosions erupting in their midst. The battlesuits lay down salvos of missiles in an attempt to blunt the Imperial counterattack. Entire platoons of the guardsmen were torn apart by the lines of death stitched by heavy burst cannons. But the Raven Guard have ever been masters of the ambush, and they knew their craft well. They had anticipated such a response from the Tau. Indeed, they had counted on it. The artillery batteries began to refocus their aim, targeting their bombardments to land behind the main body of the Tau invasion force to cut off any lines of retreat. Moments later, shadowy forces began to emerge from within what the Tau had mistaken for thick morning mists. The Raven Guard had entered the fray, seemingly assailing the Tau forces from every direction. They swiftly surrounded pockets of Tau resistance, cutting them down before disappearing back into the mist once more. Amongst them strode Furion Peak's Counter-Strike Command, each Space Marine an indomitable champion of humanity. Without fear or hesitation, they sought out the deadly Riptide battlesuits and, with blade, claw, and psychic energies, they struck them down. Shadowsun was caught in the thick of the fighting when the Space Marine commanders joined the attack. Even though her race's knowledge of Psychers was limited, she had encountered the Gwaelar's witches before, and was well aware of the threat they posed. Activating her XV-22 battlesuit's cloaking device, she blended into the mists and darted her way through the press towards the Stormseer. Scant heartbeats later, Subeday was consumed by the superheated fury of Shadowsun's fusion blasters, and with this demise, the ghostly psychic mist that had shrouded much of the battlefield began to dissipate. As the air cleared, the full gravity of Shadowsun's predicament was revealed. She looked on in horror at the sight of yet more Imperial reinforcements, pouring forth from the gaping maw of Furion Peak's majestic gate came the White Scars. Engines roaring as they sped forth to encircle the Tau army. Behind them marched the full might of House Terran. Over 30 Imperial Knights, with Patriarch Tybalt and the Obsidian Knight at their head. The Cadian 724th emerged from their dugouts to lend their weight to the big Imperial push, each company supported by a steel phalanx tank squadron. Shadowsun knew that victory against such odds was nigh impossible, but resolved that she would try to save as many of her kin as possible. She relayed urgent instructions to her reserve cadres that were inbound aboard a wave of mantas. Rather than take the fight to the enemy below, they were to focus on driving them back from a number of key locations and buy the Tau ground forces time to retreat. In the meantime, she gave the order to fall back and regroup. Shadowsun turned her attention back to the battle just in time to save her life. Having carved his way through the press, Khosrau Khan was almost upon her, his oath to slay the Tau commander not forgotten. Were it not for the intervention of her loyal bodyguards, the Khan would undoubtedly have taken Shadowsun's head. As it was, the sacrifice of her kin enabled her to overcharge her battlesuit's shields just in time to divert the White Scar's blow. So did the Tau commander cheat death. Khosrau Khan's blade carved a furrow across her chest instead of severing her head. Shadowsun's reprieve came with the timely arrival of a rapid insurgent force dropping from above to rescue their sorely wounded commander. Khan was driven back by the overwhelming firepower of the elite crisis battlesuit teams before he could finish his prey. Despite the arrival of Tau reinforcements, it was too late for them to turn the tide. The Imperial ambush had been so swift that the Tau forces were assailed on every front within minutes of setting foot on Voltores. When word spread of the near-fatal injuries sustained by their supreme commander, the resolve of the Firecast broke. With their leader cast down and lacking the iron discipline of the Adeptus Astartes, the Tau suffered appalling casualties as they retreated from the Furion Peak. The Imperial Knights and Space Marines gave merciless chase, and only the formidable firepower of the Tau Mantas and Paradox squadrons prevented a total massacre. Many Tau gave their lives to ensure that Shadowsun was safely extracted from the war zone, a sacrifice she had not forgotten and has sworn to avenge. The Tau Armada returned to rejoin Orgvayr's expeditionary fleet, humbled by their disastrous defeat. Having learned much from her failure, Shadowsun swore before the Orgvayr to redouble her efforts, and now leads the Tau onwards with renewed zeal. Warzone Damnos. Year 973 to 999, Millennium 41. A clash of empires. Damnos is a frozen ice-bound world with a chilling secret lurking beneath its crust. The planet's human settlers awoke an unholy terror so powerful that even the might of the Ultramarines' Second Company could not match it. Only full-scale war between the Adeptus Astartes and the Necron battle host could restore humanity's faith in its own supremacy. The dormant threat. The ice-clad world of Damnos, a mining planet in the eastern Ultima Segmentum, was settled long ago in the days of the Great Crusade. Humanity had dwelt there for the best part of 10,000 years, carving settlements and man-made canyons into the permafrost, as they delved ever deeper in search of mineral wealth. Yet the Imperial settlers were not the first to lay claim to Damnos, for another had slumbered under the ice from time immemorial. The mining plant's fusion generators had been sunk amongst the ruins of an ancient Xenos civilization, The first sign of the dormant presence beneath the planet's skin was a series of powerful earthquakes over the course of 274973, Millennium 41. Tectonic upheavals that wreaked havoc amongst the icy mine chasms of the world. In the wake of these tremors, the geothermic station arrays of Mandos Prime suffered a series of critical failures. Teams of repair servitors and exofabricators were sent in, and as they hunted down each station's sanctity engines for repair, the glare of their lamps illuminated unnatural shapes and runes revealed by the earth-shaking quakes. Shapes that certain factions of the Imperium would give almost anything to capture and investigate. Once rumors got out about the discoveries, Magos Karnak of the Adeptus Mechanicus was quick to assume command of the excavation. His tech priests took control over all of the mining operations taking place across the planet, and a number of Xenos samples were taken back to the stronghold of Geoth Majoris for study. Much to their frustration, however, they were unable to gain entry to the arcane portals frozen into the ruins. It would not be long before their curiosity was sated once and for all. The world beneath. The Adeptus Mechanicus are well known for delving into the hidden places of the galaxy, taking risks that would make a Space Marine's blood run cold in their never-ending quest to find the standard template constructs that form the basis for the Imperium's technology and are the pinnacle of their religion. The workers of Damnos knew nothing of the horrors they were inadvertently awaking at the Mechanicus' behest, nor that their actions would see the planet scoured of all human life within a year. A bleak inheritance. The seismic activity was little more than a precursor to the carnage to come. The original inhabitants of Damnos awoke, and in 779973, Millennium 41, the original inhabitants of Damnos awoke. All across the planet, the skeletal machine creatures known as Necrons began to emerge from the chasms and fissures left by the tectonic upheaval. Their numbers were staggering. All who set eyes upon them knew that they brought death, and death alone. First of all were the ice mine colonies. Monstrous canoptic spiders and swarms of scarabs boiled out of the darkness, slaughtering the panicking miners with emerald gorse beams and silvered claws. A handful of workers survived long enough to reach the nearest settlements and manufactorums, but the Necrons were not far behind. Within the space of a year, the majority of Damnos' tomb complexes had been awoken from their deathless slumber. Phalanx after phalanx of Necrons stalked out into the icy air of the surface world, tightly packed ranks that were endless in number. The planetary defense force found itself under attack from a foe so advanced that even death could not stop them. To make matters worse, terrible storms erupted across Damnos Prime, the electromagnetic spectres that accompanied them making distress calls all but impossible. It seemed to the citizens of Damnos that the storms acted like a malevolent sentience, clustering around comm centers and scrambling cogitator engines whenever a Vox-Psalm link was established. The Ark Guard, garrison regiments of which were posted right across Damnos, had no hope of bringing their full might to bear, with their Vox network disabled by the Necron comm shroud. Everywhere they engaged the Xenos, their tanks were blasted into smoking ruin by the weird techno-sorcery of the Necrons. Though they fought bravely, the planetary defense force had no real chance. The defenders of Damnos Prime were systematically disintegrated, one settlement at a time. Within the space of a few months, the entire continent of Damnos Prime had fallen as silent as the grave. The floating necropolis. As the weeks passed, it became obvious to the citizens of Damnos Secundus that an event of planet-threatening magnitude was taking place. Fortunately, The Tyrian Ocean sat between the capital city, Kellenport, and the rising Xenos threat. Lord Governor Arxis almost choked on his amasec when the sea-borne fleet known as the Tyrene Vessel Web reported a dense formation of pyramidal structures crossing the waters in his direction. According to the Vessel Web's scrambled reports, the Cyclopean structures were not borne upon the ocean waves, but hovering above them. The Xenos war engines were arranged in a grid formation, an ancient city that had somehow come to life. Crescent-shaped attack craft patrolled the channels between each segmentum, and the whole formation was surrounded by green lightning that obliterated the Imperial vessels monitoring its progress. More disturbing still, the vessel web detected the energy signature of an extra-dimensional sinkhole pulsing below them in the Tyrian abyss. The ocean itself was draining away at the floating city's passage. Voices in the night. The Lord Governor immediately mobilized every regiment under his command. Archguard, Valian Dragoon, and Cadian Shock Trooper alike scrambled to combat readiness. He called the Imperial battleship Nobilis into geostationary orbit above Kellenport and retreated to his Proteus-class command bunker, ordering his astropaths to send out a plea for aid. Being psychic in nature, the distress call bypassed the Necron comm shroud and echoed out across the ether. None other than Chief Librarian Tigurius of the Ultramarines intercepted the transmission, relaying it to the headstrong Captain Sicarius of the Second Company. Deep in the reaches of space, the strike cruiser Valen's Revenge set a course for Damnos. Later that week, a picked cast from the massacre in Hallerheim reached the major population centers of Damnos Secundus. Its horrific visuals were accompanied by a Necron hologram relaying a message in staccato high Gothic. The content was clear. This world belongs to the Necrons, and they would scour humanity from its surface without remorse. The Siege of Kellenport. With Imperial morale at a new low, the Necron war front burnt a path across Damnos Secundus until, by 020974 Millennium 41, Kellenport was completely besieged. Scattered Vox snippets and picked skull footage reported heavy and sustained bombardment from crescent-shaped pylon guns, each the size of an Imperial hab block that had broken through the permafrost to spit beams of green fire into the skies. Every time the Imperial defenders brought their tank battalions or macro cannon emplacements to bear, they would be swiftly obliterated by the eye-searing lightning of the Gorse pylons. Furthermore, the Necron warrior constructs were proving incredibly durable. Lasfire barely scorched them, and they stalked through clouds of burning promethium without harm. Even when a lucky shot put one of the deathless constructs down, it would often rise up once more to rejoin the fray, eroding the fighting spirit of the Imperial defenders to the point that military cohesion became all but impossible. Crippled by internal division and panic, the teeming hive of Arcona City was mercilessly depopulated within the space of a single day. Only a thin line of Imperial Guard now lay between the Necron war phalanxes and Kellenport itself. However, Arxis still had a trump card to play. As the capital city was besieged by a Necron force of unprecedented size, the Imperial battleship Nobilis rained down barrage after barrage of melted torpedoes from orbit high above, incinerating a good portion of the Necron army on the plains surrounding the city. With each detonation, a great cheer went up from the Imperial Guardsmen and ex-minor militia who were yet defending the city. Yet, as it seemed the tide of the battle would turn in the Imperial's favor, thick lances of emerald fire shot up from the Necron Gorse pylons to slam through the Nobilis' shields and carve through its hull. The detonation of the ship's warp drives lit the sky above Kellenport with a maddening kaleidoscope of light. In the nearby Krastia shipyards, an eclectic fleet of ships was powering up in the hope of last-minute evacuation. Before they could launch, however, they were overrun by flesh-wrapped nightmares that rose from the ground to tear apart the terrified refugees with razored claws. Lord Governor Arxis didn't even reach the door of his command bunker before a swarm of burrowing Necron tomb constructs breached his haven and pulled him apart. Outcast, and with their morale in tatters, the surviving defenders commended their souls to the Emperor and retreated into Kellenport's inner bastion complex. In their panic, the blue symbol flickering on Arxis' hololith array had gone unnoticed. Thunder and fury. The Ultramarines of the Second Company, alerted to Damnos' plight by the astropathic summons, translated from the warp into real space above the beleaguered planet. Captain Cato Sicarius ordered the Valen's Revenge to approach Damnos from the shelter of the Nobilis' remains. This proved to be a wise tactic, for the Necrons responded by sending great beams of Gorse energy arcing towards the strike cruiser. It remains a testament to the skill of the Revenge's helmsman that it was not torn in half. Nonetheless, such was the volume of incoming fire that the strike cruiser was hit 3 times, shuddering with each impact. The last Gorse beam wounded Valen's Revenge sorely, but not before the Ultramarines had launched their drop pods towards the Platte's surface, scarring the skies like a rain of blazing comets. Sicarius' orbital strike force hammered down into the plazas and boulevards of Kellenport, deploying from their drop pods imperfect Codex Astartes dispersal patterns, with their bolters blazing. Chainsword and heavy weapon alike brought the fury of the Adeptus Astartes to the Necron phalanxes. But even when the Space Marines had joined the forces with the surviving Imperial Guard, the Xenos did not bow before their onslaught. Many good men were lost before the Space Marines eventually secured a costly victory. It was a story that would become bitterly familiar over the rest of the campaign. The Adeptus Astartes fought with every weapon at their disposal, testing their mettle against a succession of Necron lords, and finding that their alien foes were every bit as ruthless and indomitable as themselves. Yet Sicarius would not yield. The Gorse pylons were disabled or destroyed one by one, allowing the Ultramarines to land their armoured support and reinforce their embattled brethren. Captain Sicarius himself cut down dozens of Necron raiders and single-handedly crippled a looming Necron war engine with a well-placed grenade. In the end, though, the heroics of the Second Company barely slowed the Xenos advance. In every theatre of war, the Ultramarines were struggling to hold the Necrons at bay. A hero's fate. Captain Sicarius led from the front, as was his custom. Despite his valour, he found his attack stymied by the near-infinite number of the foe. In his frustration, Sicarius fought to buy his men the time they needed by using himself and his command squad as bait. It was not long before Sicarius had hacked a path to the Pharaon, acting as supreme overlord of the Xenos force, a gilded giant of a Necron known as the Undying. A searing blast from Sicarius' plasma pistol tore off the creature's jaw, yet still it came on. The duel was closely matched, but the Necron leader's raw strength proved the deciding factor. Its war scythe cut deep into the captain's torso, dealing a grievous wound that laid Sicarius low. Roaring from his vox grills, the venerable dreadnought, Agrippin, stormed through the Necron ranks to protect the body of the fallen captain. Crushed by the armoured behemoth's battle fury, the Xenos overlord phased out and returned to the darkness of its tomb. In the absence of a guiding hand, the Necron legions fell back on defensive protocols that were predictable and slow, a critical weakness that saw hundreds of them destroyed. Sicarius' men recovered their stricken leader, driving the Xenos army back before withdrawing, as planned, to the evacuation site. Sicarius had tasted defeat in battle for the first time. though the valiant rearguard had allowed the plant survivors time to withdraw. Over half the Second Company had given their lives in exchange for those of a few thousand refugees. It was a hard-won victory indeed. Each Space Marine is worth more to the Imperium than 100 lesser men, and Damnos still rested in the hands of the Necrons. Sidebar: The Herald of Dismay. The Necron lords that acted as lieutenants for the Undying in the fall of Damnos each had a talent for preying on the lesser races. The Herald of Dismay was instrumental in breaking the morale of the Damnosians with harrowing images and hololithic propaganda broadcasts. His image flickered in the skies above Kellenport during the last stages of the war, and his words echoed in the ears of settlers and space marines alike. The doom of man was at hand. Their efforts were in vain, their defense futile. Yet the Imperium's finest fought on regardless. The fall of Damnos. Though amongst the first full-scale conflicts between the Ultramarines and the Necrons had proven far from unique, the rise of the Necrons had continued apace all across the Imperium. One by one, their tomb worlds had awoken and begun to rebuild their empire. Initially, by the conquest of the upstart settlers that had taken residence on sovereign Necron soil, and later, by the relentless and mercilessly efficient invasion of nearby worlds and systems. News of the Necron threat had spread far and wide, despite the best efforts of the Inquisition to suppress all knowledge of the alien empire's resurrection. Worse still, the fact that the Xenos were powerful enough to triumph against not only the Imperial Guard, but also the Adeptus Astartes, and the Ultramarines at that, had shaken the Imperium's faith in its military supremacy. Reports of once prosperous worlds yielding to Necron reconquest across Ultima Segmentum eventually found their way to Terra. Incensed by their loss, the fabricated general of the Adeptus Mechanicus united the High Lords in a fateful accord. An example had to be made. The Ultramarines would be tasked with returning to Damnos in force and eradicating the Necron threat infesting it once and for all. Only then would the point be made to the galaxy at large. Nothing, be it demon, heretic, or Xenos fiend, could stay the wrath of the Adeptus Astartes. The news came to Ultima in the form of the most experienced Death Watch strike teams the Ordo Xenos could provide. Led by Squad Lazarius, a crack insertion unit who had successfully destabilized the catacomb world of Daedalon, the High Lords believed that the specialist skills of the Death Watch could make all the difference to the success of the attack. Better yet, they knew that the Ultramarines were more likely to accede to a request made by a Space Marine than a robed functionary of the Adeptus Terra. Rumor had it that one of the Death Watch sergeants who arrived in Ultramar was Davian Imocles, an old squad mate of Sicarius's, and that the two friends broke Ultramar protocol by meeting before official greetings had been observed. Still, the arrival of the Death Watch was cause for much discussion in the ranks of the Ultramarines, for they, above all Imperial forces, were trained to neutralize and destroy Xenos entities. When Watch Captain Lazarius relayed the news of the High Lord's plan to Marneus Calgar on the idyllic world of Hera, the chapter master was far from pleased. Marneus Calgar had extensively reviewed Sicarius's after-action reports following the previous incident on Damnos, and he knew full well that the Second Company had faced but a small portion of the Necron's true strength. This time, his Ultramarines would face a fully awakened tomb world teeming with Necron defenses. Calgar's thoughts had long been troubled by the true scale of the threat lurking under Damnos' icy crust. The chapter master knew he would lose many hundreds of good men in the reconquering of Damnos, yet the course was clear. The Ultramarines had failed to destroy their foes during the fall of Damnos, a failure that had to be remedied. Though he was loath to admit it, Calgar knew in his heart that the High Lords were right. The morale of the Imperium was at stake. It was the duty of the Ultramarines, to see the battle they had started decades ago to its bloody conclusion. The children of Damnos. 25 long years had passed before the spectre of Damnos had come back to haunt the Ultramarines. It was a whole generation for mortal men, though a relatively short span in the lifetime of a space marine. The Second Company had won countless victories since Damnos, but the ordeals upon the Xenos-infested planet had not been forgotten. Many of the Ultramarines who had fought there were still anxious for redemption. This was true most of all of Cato Sicarius. The grievous blow dealt to him by the Necron monarch outside Kellenport had long since healed, but the wound to his pride remained. So it was that when Marneus Calgar announced that the warriors of Ultramar would return to Damnos in force, the Second Company with them, Cato Sicarius smiled for the first time in decades. After the original fall of Damnos, the rescued settlers had relocated to Tarentus, an agri-world upon the fringe of the Ultramar Empire. The Damnosians had begun new lives, working hard to repatriate themselves as citizens of that great realm. As the soldiers and miners put their haunted past aside to start families and fresh careers, a new generation grew to young adulthood. The surviving Damnosians had already impressed the warriors of Ultramar with their valor and bravery on the field of battle, and their sons and daughters had worked and trained so hard that they had also won the respect of the Adeptus Astartes watching over them. Some had even proven strong enough to become Ultramarines in their own right. The 10th Company squad, known as the Ice Talons, trained under Torius Telian, were of Damnosian stock. Marneus Calgar was always a wise and prudent ruler. He knew that the upcoming war was as much about the Imperium's soul as it was the body, and so he gave the refugee families of the Ice Planet a chance to fight for the world that they had been forced to abandon. Almost every adult amongst them volunteered. For many of the hardy settlers, it was the only hope they had of banishing the mechanical skeletons that stalked their dreams. The Imperial war engine slowly began to gather speed. The 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and 6th Companies of the Ultramarines were mustered from war zones within Ultima Segmentum. Over 500 Space Marines to be led into battle by Calgar himself. All extant information on Damnos was dissected in painstaking detail, and the training cages rang night and day with the sound of steel on steel. It was said that Cato Sicarius trained so hard he even slept in the cage vault, and that he fought with the fury of a man possessed. Before the month was out, Calgar's preparations were complete. Instead of translating from the warp into Damnos' orbit, the Grand Fleet of Ultramar emerged within the neighboring planet of Utinos, an inert gas giant with a radioactive asteroid belt. Once more, the Ultramarine fleet's helmsmen proved up to their allocated tasks. The Imperial warships entered real space within the outer layers of the gas giant, completely hidden from sight by swirling ochroid vapors. A ruse within a ruse. Calgar's next order was for the torpedo batteries of the Victrix Ultra to detonate several macro-class warheads near to the planet's asteroid belt, knocking the largest of their number out of orbit and sending them sailing past Damnos. One by one, the asteroids detached from the Altinos belt. Slowly, with utmost caution, the Ultramarine fleet went with them. To the Damnosian cryptex observing the celestial event, the electronic signatures of the fleet were lost amongst the radioactive rocks. Reports of the Utinos event were relayed, but the Necron lords of Damnos were far more concerned with their own power struggles. They paid the oncoming shower of debris little heed. Calgar's approach plan had worked perfectly. By the time the Necrons on the surface had spotted their presence, the Ultramarines' warships were already in position to launch their drop pods. Wave after wave of the craft flared bright as they crackled through the upper atmosphere, plummeting towards the surface of Damnos with tooth-rattling speed. The fully active pylon networks below intercepted dozens of the hurtling drop pods. stitching the skies with green lightning and smashing many of the attack craft into thousands of pieces. The pylons had accessed the positional data from the invasion of the Second Company all those years ago, and their targeting systems predicted the descent patterns well. Those few that made it through the Gorse net slammed into the surface of Damnos and opened to reveal that they held not Space Marines, but automated weaponry. It was then that the decoy tactics became clear. The strike cruiser Hero's Fist, Blade of Judgment, Talasar's Tempest, and Lion of Calth dived out from the asteroid cloud and roared towards the planet's surface south of Kellenport. Within seconds of breaking cover, the warships had hurled their drop pods from their launch bays, each carrying a squad of Space Marines. The Gorse pylon networks could not recalibrate their firing solutions in time to intercept Calgar's true invasion force. As the landing craft made planetfall and slammed open, hundreds of Space Marines deployed into perfect formation. Death Watch strike teams, emerging from black-armored drop pods into the depths of the Necron tomb complexes, moved in to begin missions of sabotage against the Necron reinforcements moving to surround the Ultramarines. On the Belenus ice plains behind them, bulk landers lowered their ramps to disgorge regiments of vengeful Imperial Guard. The Imperium had arrived in force. The Wrath of the Necrons. In the heart of the tomb complexes that surrounded Kellenport, monoliths and cyclopean obelisks shuddered free of the ice and rose majestically into the air. Piece by piece, the floating necropolis that had scoured human life from Damnos assembled itself once more. Fully powered, the grid of deadly war machines drifted towards the Space Marines with the inevitability of death. Doom sighs wailed into the skies on intercept courses with the Thunderhawk gunships that reinforced the ground assault. The crescent-shaped Necron fighters flew with uncanny maneuverability, carving off whole sections of their enemy's fuselage with rays of energy. Though the Ultramarine Storm Ravens returned fire, 3 of the mightiest Space Marine craft were crippled beyond recovery. The Thunderhawk Vengeance Ulixis turned end over end, trails of greasy black smoke scoring the sky as it ploughed into the Ultramarines scattered below. The collision crippled 2 whole squads, but it slowed the Imperial advance not for one moment. Incredibly, several of the Space Marines' passengers fought their way free of the Vengeance's burning debris and joined the ranks of their brethren, bloodied but unbowed. The rest of the Ultramarines' transports landed, releasing squads of Predators, Hunters and Vindicators from their armored bellies, whilst cohorts of war-suited Centurions laid down covering fire with daunting precision. Company by company, the Ultramar squads took up position near the pyramidal complex that Calgar had identified as the heart of the Necron grid. They were making good progress until the floating city hovered into view. A crackling field of green energy arced around the Xenos formation, dispersing the las cannon fire of the Predator assassin squads, testing its defenses. In return, thunderous bolts of emerald lightning lashed out from the crystals atop each of the monoliths, grounding spectacularly in the ranks of the Space Marines, and sending powered armored limbs spinning high into the air. The source of the crackling energy became clear as the Xenos formation crested the ridge. In the center of the grid hummed 4 angular quadrants linked by bolts of energy. Shining within their interior was a sphere of blinding light that held a splayed humanoid form. The green lightning that crackled out to surround the necropolis was eye-searingly bright wherever it touched the writhing creature inside the sphere. Ahead of it came the silhouette of the Undying, reborn once more and leading his high court to war. Calgar's hand had been forced. Sending a tight beam transmission to his reserves in orbit, he summoned a precise orbital bombardment, followed by a teleport strike from a full half of the First Company. Battle was about to be joined in earnest. As the head of the Chapter Librarius, Chief Librarian Tigurius locked his gaze with that of the bound creature, and strained to understand the titanic technologies that were being brought to bear against it. Wiping tears of blood from his cheeks, the librarian mind-linked a message to Marneus Calgar. The shining figure inside was a physical incarnation of a Katan star god, a legend given form and bound against its will to power the Necron engines of war. It was imperative that the towering creature be neutralized, for it was the source of the floating necropolis's defense shield, and it had the power to turn Damnos itself against them. Irresistible force. As phalanx after phalanx of Necrons stalked from the snows, the ground war began in earnest. Volleys of long-range missile fire from whirlwind and thunderfire cannon batteries thundered into the Necrons stalking towards the Imperial ranks, knocking dozens of the creatures from their feet with each explosion. As per Calgar's orders, whenever a Necron slumped into the snow, the Ultramarine tactical squads would advance and pour a bolt of fire into it to ensure it did not rise again. Yet the phalanxes lurched onward, crushing the fallen underfoot. As one, the entire column of Necrons halted at some invisible signal, raised their gauze flares, and fired a strobing fusillade of energy into the ranks of the Ultramarines. The beams stripped away armor, flesh and bone, until the remains of once proud Space Marines writhed, steaming in the snow. In response, massed assault squads and a thunderous cadre of dreadnoughts ploughed into the tightly packed ranks of the foe. Chainswords and power fists chewed through cables and crushed mechanical sinews, forcing the Necrons to abandon their fire discipline and fall upon the new threat in melee. Sicarius stormed forward to reinforce his men, for the Xenos numbers were thickening as ever more constructs emerged from the ice. As a high suzerain barged his way through the Necron warriors closing in on his battle brothers, keening packs of flayed ones pulled their way out of the permafrost and impaled the raging Space Marines from below with their razor-sharp talons. In their midst was a leaping, slashing monster of metal and stolen skin, whose every blow hurled an assault marine 10 feet across the ice. Sicarius made a beeline for the creature, raising his Tempest blade in the briefest of salutes before engaging it in a lightning-fast exchange of blows. To the south of the Ultramarine army, the Tarentan Imperial Guard took a heavy toll on waves of approaching destroyers, and on the tomb blades escorting ghost arcs towards the Ultramarines' flank. Battle cannon shells detonated in the midst of the Xenos, stunning the Necron gun constructs and leaving them easy prey for the ruby beams of las cannon fire from the guardsmen manning the gantries of the nearby research station. Harsh shouts of triumph were soon replaced by piercing screams as portal-bearing Night Sighs translocated Necron warriors into their midst. It was all the chance the destroyers needed. A second wave of the malevolent machine beasts rose out of the snow to exterminate any guardsman who dared sneak a glance over the armored parapet. Stalemate. Everywhere the Imperial army struck, the Necrons countered with lethal force. Calgar felt like a duelist being slowly taken apart by a superior foe. The battlefield logic of the Necrons was impeccable. Whatever intelligence was controlling the Xenos army was anticipating the Ultramarines' every move and neutralizing every set-piece they employed. The Codex Astartes has much to say on the subject of engaging a foe with superior technology, yet every feint and lunge Calgar made was met with a shield of logic that left his men fighting for their lives. Every plasma volley and melter blast employed against the floating necropolis found its energy dissipated harmlessly. Every bolt or shell was prematurely detonated before it could harm the monoliths within. Crack missiles blew sinister Triarch constructs apart, only for their glowing remains to scuttle back together moments later. The chapter master felt a cold shiver creep over him as he realized the Necrons had analyzed and broken down the Ultramarines' battle doctrine, just as the Xenos had been studied in their turn. Their only hope was to strike from an unexpected direction. Ahead, the gauze pylon that loomed over the battlefield whirred and pivoted as it fired pinpoint beams of emerald energy into the skies, darting from one aerial target to the next, as the strike cruisers far above attempted to reinforce their brethren. Storm Talon and Thunderhawk gunships alike were blasted from the air as the Gorse beam stabbed through the swirling snowstorm with pitiless efficiency. Calgar could just make out a camouflage squad of scouts, the Ice Talons of the 10th Company, clambering up the base of the Gorse pylon and clamping their melter bombs onto its jointed neck before vaulting backwards into the safety of a deep snowdrift. Above them, a white-hot explosion crippled the machine's motive units, and uncontrollable Gorse energy roared into the night as the resultant energy pulse overloaded its power systems. The shield shattered. Inspiration burnt through the chapter master's mind. With his honor guard storming forward in his wake, Calgar sprinted towards the malfunctioning pylon, smashing his way through the ranks of Necron immortals that were moving to protect it. The chapter master lashed out left and right to pulverize Xenos torsos and heads wherever he struck, for a terrible wrath was roused within him, and his resolve to reach the Gorse pylon was all but unstoppable. Jumping onto the metallic base of the malfunctioning pylon, Calgar braced himself and heaved with both hands at its crescent-shaped superstructure. Servos and pistons whined in protest as the famed gauntlets of Ultramar left grooves in its living metal. Teeth gritted and eyes screwed tight, the chapter master pushed with everything he had, veins popping under his close-cropped grey hair. He roared in pain with the bone-breaking effort of his feet, but sure enough, the pylon began to move on its bearings, its flaring Gorse beam crackling across the skies above the warring armies. Slowly, inexorably, Calgar pushed the war engine's crescent back upon itself until its beam met the energy grid that protected the floating necropolis. The snowstorm flared blinding white as a tremendous explosion flattened everything within 100 meters. The auto-sensors of the Space Marines spared the majority of them from being blinded by the energy burst, though those nearby were not so lucky. Squads Atracian, Melicus, and Thriacus were vaporized in an instant, along with the entire phalanx of Necron warriors they were fighting. The energy shield that protected the floating necropolis vanished, and in the backlash, the Tesseract vault at its heart was broken wide open. A demigod uncaged. Rising above the Necron army was a giant cruciform figure of pure light, the remnants of its energy cage still crackling around it. It roared in exultation at its newfound freedom, the booming sound throwing Ultramarines and Necrons alike to the icy ground. Louder and louder it grew, until the planet's crust began to crack beneath it. As the being's shout struck the surface's resonant frequency, cracks became fissures, and fissures became chasms, hurling hundreds of stunned Necrons to an icy doom. Tigurius' mind passed a warning to Calgar. This being was a manifestation of the star god Igranaya, the Molder of Worlds, whose very thoughts could break apart a planet and reshape it in a form more pleasing to him. The floating city had halted at the mighty explosion. At its heart, the gilded Necron overlord known as the Undying was bellowing outraged commands to the glowing figure above them, his arms raised imperiously. With laughter like tectonic plates colliding, the star god reached out a taloned hand and made a fist. Around the Undying, the ground split open, forming a titanic hand that crushed the Necron like an insect. The Xenos Lord flashed white and vanished. At the heart of the Necron tomb complex, the surviving members of Squad Lazarius had reached their objective. The Undying, having phased out moments before, had teleported back to his cabled sarcophagus right in front of their eyes. Unfortunately for the Necron, the Death Watch had replaced his revivification engines with melter charges and entropic destabilizers. A thin scream echoed through the Necron tomb as the Death Watch put the lie to the Undying's name, blasting him into his component atoms. catastrophe and conquest. On the planet's crust, the Necron's forces reeled from the loss of their leader and the power structure at their army's heart, the Ultramarines. Their sonic dampeners and optic shields protecting them from the worst of the Katan's baleful energies were deft enough to avoid the catastrophic damage that was being wreaked upon Damnos by Agralan, the World Shaper. The supporting fire of the Devastator units and Imperial Guard on the ridge overlooking the carnage was taking a heavy toll upon the Necrons that had escaped the Katan's wrath, and the battle looked all but over until the God Thing turned its wrath on the Space Marines. Lumpen fists of rock burst out from the ground, seizing up the cobalt-armored warriors falling back to their transports and crushing them to paste. Squad after squad were destroyed by the laughing entity as it floated overhead. The being passed over Cato Sicarius as he dueled, the captain panting hard with the exertion of his fight with the flesh-wrapped Necron Lord. The flayed Lord's head snapped up in alarm as it finally registered Agralan's presence, a sliver of opportunity that Sicarius had trained hard to exploit. The captain fell to one knee under the creature's flashing talons and rammed the Thalassarian Tempest blade vertically into its torso, shorting out its phased circuits and dooming the fiend to a final death. His vision swimming, Sicarius summoned 25 years of anger and frustration and channeled it into a last burst of strength. He unclipped the strangely wrought grenade that had been given to him by his old friend Damocles in their clandestine meeting, and ran headlong towards the Katan that had passed overhead. Leaping over the claws of the flayed ones that grasped for him, he activated the weapon, a vortex grenade of ancient design, and flung it at the creature. The Katan's horned head whipped around in a half circle, its face contorted with rage, and Sicarius was caught in mid-air by a giant rocky fist. Just as the vice-like fingers began to close, the vortex grenade detonated. A spiraling orb of nothingness burst out from the device, its unstoppable force sucking the Katan into the warp before the vortex collapsed and winked out of existence. Damnos reclaimed. Even as Sicarius staggered to his feet, the battle was won. The earthquakes that had spread outwards from the Katan's rampage shuddered to a halt. Over the next few days, the Ultramarines took apart the remainder of the Necron army with a grim efficiency that saw none of the Xenos survive. Empty tomb complexes were collapsed or detonated under the methodical guidance of the Death Watch, and as mass contingents of the Adeptus Mechanicus arrived, all evidence of the war against the Necrons was eradicated or taken from the planet. Many intriguing items of Xenos technology were missing over the course of the reclamation program, but the air of victory was so infectious that none pressed the matter or their absence too closely. The Necrons of Damnos had finally been defeated. Calgar, who had learned much about the Xenos foe over the course of the campaign, consolidated the knowledge he had torn from Damnos and penned it into a data scroll, which he circulated to the chapter masters of the Adeptus Astartes. Such hard-won data was invaluable. Its distribution was a great strategic victory in its own right, and yet it was not the most lasting lesson the Imperium would take from the Reconquest. The populace, rescued by Sicarius and the Second Company all those years ago, was shipped back from Tarentus and given the entire world of Damnos to claim as their own. The sons and daughters who had joined the Ultramarines were stationed upon the planet to watch over them and train them in the ways of war. Slowly but surely, Damnos was brought back into the Imperial fold. The message was clear, a message stridently broadcast across the Imperium by the agents of the High Lords of Terror. Humanity could triumph over any foe, no matter how deadly. The galaxy belonged to man, and man alone. Warzone Orgvayr. The emergence of the Great Rift shook the leagues of Votan to their foundations. Holds vanished amidst the roiling energies of the warpstorm belt. Trade routes were severed. Many kindreds were compelled to relocate their holdings, abandoning territories held for thousands of years and venturing out from the galactic core to seek more stable regions to settle. Both within the core and beyond its fringes, the Rift's advent has driven the kin into new conflicts, as well as stirring up old foes and settling them on a collision course with the leagues. The kin do not recognize or name the Great Rift as a single manifest phenomena. They believe that to do so would lend further superstitious menace to a threat that is already menacing enough. They choose instead to name the greatest of the component warp storms that have opened within the galactic core, treating each as a separate peril to be weathered and overcome. One such raging empiric maelstrom opened upon the northeastern fringe of Greater Thurian League space, and was soon named Orgvayr, roughly translated in High Gothic as the Ogre. The Void Strider kindred and Lakria's kindred were swallowed up in the instant of its opening. Their pan-spectral arrays gave some small forewarning, and so ragged flotillas of kin refugee ships limped from the fringes of Orgvayr days after its emergence, their passengers telling of holds dissolved into raw madness or overrun by howling demons. Close on their heels came ravening chaos warfleets, sailing the void in baroque warships and monstrous hulks. They fell upon the Greater Thurian system bordering the storm zone. As more chaos worshippers poured out of Orgvayr by the day, it became clear to the Greater Thurian League that a terrible new threat had been unleashed upon their holds. Those kindreds whose holds lay directly in the invaders' path now faced a difficult choice: to hold their ground against the onslaught, or to fall back in the face of growing enemy strength. Exchanging messages as best they could via hardened LASCOM relays, the hearthspakes of the Deep Rock kindred, the kindred of Vorton, Karl's Starbreaker kindred, and kindred Crimson II, all elected to hold fast. The Grimnir interfaced in their fanes with the Greater Thurian Votan, asking that it communicate their plight to the wider League and begging its advice. Swift merchant craft and scout ships plunged into the warp, bearing the same messages to neighbouring kindreds. Those facing the invasion would stand firm until the will of the Votan and the League could be made known, or until their defiance was judged too costly to maintain. Meanwhile, the ravening hordes of chaos blazed a trail of havoc towards the hold worlds that lay in their path. By a stroke of good fortune, Karl Uthar, the Destined, had recently returned to Obsid Gate, hold of his own kindred of Vorton. Ever the dynamic hero of his people, Uthar convinced the kindred of Vorton Hearthspeak that they could not afford to simply mass behind their defences and await their enemy's onslaught. To do so handed all strategic initiative and opportunity to the invaders, and would abandon outlying facilities, resources, and personnel to their murderous attentions. The voice of the Destined carried great weight amongst his kindred, who were swiftly convinced by his arguments. Thus, their mustered kin-host broke into a number of oath bands. Some would remain to garrison Obsid Gate, while the rest would sally forth under the command of Uthar and several other prominent heroes to launch counterattacks against the incoming Chaos invaders. Their role would be to slow the enemy wherever possible, to evacuate all resources, kin and ironkin they could, and to destroy any facilities they could not rescue so as to deny their use to the foe. Uthar the Destined's Oathband deployed to the outlying world of Torg. Riven by years of deep-core tectonic mining, Torg was a hostile mass of jagged stone, exposed magma veins, convulsing supervolcanoes, and kin harvester fortresses wreathed in toxic fumes. Several immense renegade warships had already settled in the vulnerable world's orbit and disgorged warbands of heretic Astartes to the surface. Mutated Chaos Marines of the Purge and ferocious, corn-worshipping World-Eaters had overrun Torg's void docks and cut bands of guild miners off within their harvester fortresses. Swiftly casting the eye of the ancestors over the direct strategic situation, Uthar formulated his battle plan and set his forces into motion without delay. In the void, the ships of Uthar's Oathband engaged the craft of the Chaos Worshippers at the command of Voidmaster Hemik. Their mighty conversion beam batteries and salvos of drill torpedoes mauled the Grand Cruiser Abomination and forced other Chaos warships to break off orbital bombardment in order to respond. Hemik coordinated her small but potent fleet with consummate skill, fending off each assault by the Chaos Worshippers and handing out far worse punishment than her own ships suffered. Nox Hernkin pioneer bands, supported by light gunships and rugged Sagittar ATVs, swept through the high passes of the Fumarok Range to attack the World Eaters from the rear. They launched swift hit-and-run strikes, using their pan-spectral scanners to maintain a fix on their enemies amidst the toxic murk. Goaded to action, many wrath-crazed Khorne berserkers broke off their assault on Harvester Fortress 5 and pursued Nox bands into the hazardous passes. Separating into several smaller Oath bands, Uthar the Destined's forces launched a massive drop offensive into the Shatterfields. Uthar himself led an armoured spearhead against the World Eaters of Lord Hakatar. Karlsvek Thurken and her Oathband met the Purge head-on. As orbital fire from both sides rained down, the two swirling battles erupted into a storm of close-range firefights and brutal offensives. While the foe were engaged to the north, Grimnir Khorne led an elite force of Einhir and Harskin to evacuate the Chthonians at Harvester Fortresses 2, 3, and 4. Guildkin and great quantities of raw materials were loaded aboard Hecaton land fortresses and the armoured carriages they drew behind them. Sensing their prey escaping, Urthak Skullripper led a massed teleport assault of World Eater Terminators that cut the Grimnir and her bodyguards off, even as kin forces were pulling out. Though many Chthonian berserkers turned back to hurl themselves into the fight, the living ancestor could not be rescued. The surviving Chthonians and many of the Hearthkin have since formed the Grudge Band of Khorne. They will be avenged upon Urthak Skullripper, or die trying. Uthar the Destined met Hakatar of the World Eaters upon the stone span bridging the Chasm of Embers. The two warriors battled back and forth along the crumbling expanse as their warriors fought and died around them, and pillars of volcanic fire blasted up from below. Wounded but unbowed, Uthar at last wrong-footed his foe, taking the World Eater's right leg off with a vicious sweep and pitching him, still howling with fury, into the flames below. After several hours of rapid armoured warfare, and with the vast majority of kin assets ferried successfully up to his waiting void ships, Karl Uthar commanded a full retreat from Torg. Howled accusations of cowardice from the Khorne worshippers followed the retreat. They meant nothing to the kin. All that was worth extracting from the planet had been recovered, and any remaining assets were deemed not worth the cost in lives to salvage. The Great Arthurian League Oathbands fell back in good order, Voidmaster Hemik giving the enemy flotilla a last devastating volley to scatter their formations before commanding a plunge back into warp space. The tragic death of Grimnir Khorne aside, the Torg offensive had proved successful, but the wider warzone Orgvayr was becoming more fraught and violent by the hour. A great battle lay before the Great Thurian League, and Uthar the Destined would be needed elsewhere. Warzone Pandorax. The Pandorax incursion took place between year 959 and 961 Millennium 41, when a Black Legion warfleet invaded the Pandorax system and captured the Imperial planet of Pythos. Hidden beneath this planet's surface was a portal to the warp known as the Damnation Cache, which Abaddon used to unleash a demonic legion upon the world. A ferocious campaign was fought by Imperial forces to recapture Pythos and close down the Damnation Cache, first in the depths of space, and then on the demon-infested surface of Pythos itself. The invasion of Pythos. In 959 Millennium 41, a Black Legion incursion fleet invaded the Imperial planet of Pythos in the Pandorax system. The fleet was commanded by Abaddon the Despoiler himself, and consisted of half a dozen massive battleships, each one with enough firepower to lay waste to an entire planet, supported by numerous escort craft. The incursion fleet contemptuously swept aside Pandorax's system defense craft and moved into orbit above the planet of Pythos within hours of entering the system. What Abaddon could possibly want from Pythos was by no means clear at this time. The planet was an inhospitable death world, home to a colony of hardy Imperial citizens. Most of Pythos is covered in dense jungle, which is home to massive saurian creatures happy to eat anything that moves. The oceans are inhabited by equally large predators. Because of the dangers of moving through the lowlands and across the oceans, the human settlers of Pythos clustered in mountaintop mining colonies known locally as Delver strongholds. From these, they derived a precarious and meager existence, mining the precious minerals found in the planet's mountainous chains. Hundreds of these strongholds were scattered over the planet, each home to a population of only a few thousand Imperial citizens. Pythos's only major city was the hive port of Attica, which was located on the coast of the planet's largest ocean and surrounded on its landward side by the aptly named Death Glades. Attica was a small spire city, with its main habitation zones located in the dome-like upper levels of the city, high above the surrounding swamplands. Travel between Attica and the Delver strongholds was carried out in dilapidated, lighter-than-air dirigibles known as sky barges, lumbering through the skies high above the ferocious creatures that inhabited the lowlands in relative safety. This, then, was the bleak environment which Abaddon found at Pythos. Within moments of entering orbit, his warfleet unleashed a pinpoint barrage, quickly disabling Attica's defences and blasting the bastions and barracks occupied by the city's defence forces. Blood-red rain started pouring from the skies, and the massive capital ships of the Chaos Fleet launched scores of Dreadclaw drop pods, which disgorged hundreds of Chaos Space Marines. Dozens of squads of Khorne berserkers supported by hunting packs of Forge Fiends led the assault, slaughtering the defences in a mausoleum of gore. Surprised, demoralized, and having already suffered heavy casualties, Attica's defenders broke almost at first contact. The only formation able to organize any kind of effective resistance was the 183rd Katan Jungle Fighters Regiment, stranded on the planet while en route to the Maelstrom, and even they were only able to hold out for a few hours before being forced to conduct a fighting retreat and escaping into the surrounding swamplands. Within 36 hours of Abaddon's arrival, Attica was claimed in the name of the Dark Gods. The Blood March. The Katan Jungle Fighters that had escaped the city were forced to battle their way through Pythos's predator-infested jungles, harried all the way by Black Legion murder squads. It is unlikely that any other Imperial Guard troops could have survived such a march, and even the Katachans suffered dreadfully throughout the ordeal. Battling their way past ambushes, fighting off attacks by massive reptilian monsters, and voracious man-eating plants, the Catachans finally reached the relative safety of the Olympax mountain range, just 150 miles to the east of Attica. Here, they based themselves in all-out attack by the Black Legion. Mysteriously, however, they were allowed time to regroup. Although the Black Legion continued to harry the Catachans, no serious attack on them was undertaken, and this gave the Imperial forces time to link up with each other. Although the largest concentration of Imperial troops had been located at Attica, all of the Delver strongholds had their own garrisons, and, in aggregate, these troops numbered in the tens of thousands. Colonel Deathstrike, commander of the 183rd Regiment, and now de facto Imperial governor of Pythos, quickly began to organize these widely scattered forces, using commandeered sky barges to gather a sizable army at his base camp in the Olympiax Mountains. Within a fortnight, he began planning offensive operations against the Chaos invaders of what he now considered to be his planet. The Damnation Cache. What Colonel Strike could not possibly know was that Abaddon had been far from idle. Unbeknownst to any of the Imperial citizens on the planet, Attica was built atop a hellish gateway known as the Damnation Cache. This gateway was a small but terrifyingly stable portal into the warp, through which demonic legions could travel into the material realm. Once it was captured, Abaddon would be able to summon forth a tide of wrathful demons to overwhelm the remaining defenders of Pythos, and threaten the hundreds of Imperial planets nearby. In the dark days of the Horus Heresy, vast numbers of demons had emerged from the Damnation Cache to fight against those who had remained loyal to the Emperor. Following Horus's defeat, the Damnation Cache was sealed, and in the centuries that followed, it disappeared from history. Only the demon-hunting Grey Knights retained any knowledge of the portal. So it was that when Pythos was reclaimed as an Imperial colony in Millennium 33, none but the Grey Knights, the Chaos Guards, and the few surviving Chaos Space Marines that had fought there in the Heresy knew of the horrors hidden beneath the planet's surface. However, Abaddon was one of those Traitor Legion veterans, and immediately upon his arrival on Pythos, he began the task of breaking through the wards that had been set on that infernal gateway thousands of years before. Disabling the wards was no easy task. Dozens of Abaddon's most powerful sorcerers struggled to weaken the seals, sacrificing hundreds of Attica's citizens in bloody rituals of unbinding as they did so. One by one, the ancient bindings broke, until finally, just over a month after Abaddon's warfleet had first appeared in the system, the last ward was broken, and the Damnation Cache was unsealed. Immediately, the portal into the warp reopened, and a tide of demons gushed through, rampaging out of Attica across the planet, and surging towards Colonel Strike's composite army. This time, the Catachans and their PDF allies were at least at combat readiness, but nothing could have prepared them for the tidal wave of destruction that the opening of the Damnation Cache had released. A desperate struggle erupted on the lower slopes of Mount Olympax, as wave after wave of demonic creatures crashed against the bastions and defense lines of Colonel Strike's camp. Only great heroics and terrible sacrifice prevented the base from being overrun in the first assault. Even so, it was clear to Colonel Strike that defending the newly established base camp could only result in the destruction of his entire command. Huddled together in a single location, they were an easy target for the overwhelming hordes of demons pouring forth from the Damnation Cache. Bitterly, Colonel Strike ordered the troops under his command to split up and retreat to the hundreds of Delver strongholds that were located all over Pythos. He knew that while no single settlement could resist attack, the sheer number of strongholds and their scattered location offered the best chance of some Imperial forces surviving until reinforcements arrived. If, that was, reinforcements arrived at all. Battlefleet Demeter. Although Abaddon's initial attack had been terrifyingly swift, he could not stop all messages calling for aid from being transmitted. High atop Attica, the desperate defenders had been able to hold out long enough for an astropathic distress signal to be sent streaking through the immaterium. Despite the efforts of covens of Chaos Sorcerers aboard Abaddon's flagship, the Black Legion were unable to block all of these signals, which continued to be broadcast until bloodthirsty assault squads of Khorne berserkers were finally able to smash their way into the astropathic chamber in Attica's central spire. The Pandorax system lies a short distance to the galactic south of the Maelstrom in the Demeter sector. Lying so close to Huron Blackheart's realm meant the Demeter sector was in high state of battle readiness and could react to the attack quickly. Immediately upon receiving the distress call, the closest reserve fleet in the sector was ordered to the Pandorax system. Meanwhile, transport was arranged for the 19th and 27th Imperial Guard armies as the massive resources of the Imperium swung into operation to repel Abaddon's invasion. Battlefleet Demeter's reserve fleet was under the command of Lord Admiral Orson Kranzwar, aboard his flagship, the Revenge. He was highly experienced, having fought numerous actions against Red Corsairs raiding fleets, though his background would offer little benefit against the overwhelming force of battle-scarred opposition he would encounter in the Pandorax system. Over the coming weeks and months, his fleet would fight in some of the largest space battles since the Gothic campaign. The first omen of what Battlefleet Demeter would have to endure in the coming months occurred as soon as the fleet entered the Pandorax system. The 129th Imperial Destroyer Squadron was ranging ahead of the main fleet and had just begun to pick its way through the asteroid belt that fringed the outer reaches of the star system. As they did so, they were subjected to a lightning-fast attack by Iconoclast destroyers hidden in the belt. 2 Imperial ships were lost, and the Chaos Squadron escaped unharmed, disappearing amidst the dense asteroid belt just minutes after launching their attack. Kranzwar first established a base on the tiny planet of Gaia, located on the edge of the Pandorax system. With his lines of communication secure, he then began to mount a series of raids and attacks into the asteroid field, intent on clearing a path to Pythos. In the following weeks, a series of increasingly brutal conflicts were fought in and around the asteroid belt, earning it the nickname of the Adamantium Fields, due to the myriad hulls of wrecked ships that floated there. At first, the ships of Abaddon's fleet held the upper hand, inflicting heavy losses on the Imperial flotillas as they repeatedly attempted to pick a way through the asteroid belt. However, in the long run, this was a campaign Abaddon could not hope to win, as the material superiority of his adversary and the willingness of the Imperium to accept stunning losses to break through to Pythos slowly but surely eroded the strength of the Chaos fleet. Slowly the tide began to turn, and Abaddon was forced to commit ever more ships to holding Kranzwar in check. It was at this point that Abaddon received vital assistance in the form of a raiding fleet of Red Corsairs. None can say if this came about because Abaddon and Huron Blackheart had agreed to aid each other, or simply because the Red Corsairs were drawn to the Pandorax system by the lure of conflict. Just as the giant megaloshark of the Pythosian oceans is drawn to injured prey by the scent of blood in the water. In any case, the outcome was the same. Combining their strength, the Chaos fleet swiftly drove the Imperial ships out of the Adamantium fields and back towards their base at Gaia. As they did so, the dispersed squadrons of ships belonged to the two sides gathered for a final space battle of such scale that it will be remembered for 100 generations. The Battle of Pandorax, year 960, Millennium 41. Lord Admiral Cranswar knew that he was in a dangerous position. Although the number of escort vessels under his command roughly matched those in the combined Chaos fleets, he was heavily outgunned and outnumbered in terms of capital ships. The only real advantage he held lay in the number of fast attack craft he had. The launcher bays of the Revenge and Stalwart gave him a 2-to-1 advantage over those carried by the Chaos ships. In order to maximize this strength, Cranswar decided to hold the Revenge and Stalwart back, while the rest of his ships advanced to engage the Chaos fleet. While the bulk of his ships tried to keep the Chaos fleet at arm's length, his 2 carriers would launch successive waves of attack craft, tasked with overwhelming the squadrons defending the Chaos ships and inflicting as much damage as possible. Hopefully, by the time the 2 fleets came to grips properly, the attack craft would have wreaked enough destruction to even the odds in the ensuing gun battle. Unfortunately for Cranswar, while his plan was strategically sound, it lacked guile. Although Abaddon was still on Pythos, commanding the ground campaign, his chosen lieutenant, Chaos Warlord Malgar Irongrasp, was a veteran of hundreds of space battles, and had guessed what Cranswar's strategy was likely to be, even before his sensors picked up the positions of the ships in the Imperial battle fleet. Irongrasp's ships tore forth from the adamantium fields like a battering ram, striking straight towards the heart of Cranswar's leading flotillas, smashing through the screen of Imperial attack craft. They gave Cranswar's ships no time to carry out the dainty maneuvers that he had transmitted to his command. A furious close-range battle erupted as the Chaos fleet ploughed in amongst the ships of the Imperial advance guard, their immense rippling broadsides illuminating their flanks. Hundreds of attack craft swirled and battled across the miles-long capital ships, while squadrons of escort vessels engaged in deadly close-range gunnery battles. Cranswar desperately ordered his ships to disengage. Although they had suffered heavy damage, they had given as good as they had gotten, and if he could just buy enough time to rearm and refuel his now depleted attack craft, the battle could still be won. The Imperial ships executed Cranswar's orders with a stoicism brought through many long hours of careful training. The Imperial capital ships, screened by their escorts, broke away from the Chaos fleet, while the surviving attack craft headed back to the Revenge and Stalwart to rearm. However, Irongrasp had foreseen this reaction too. Unnoticed at the back of the Chaos Warfleet, the Might of Huron, a slaughter-class cruiser, fired up the huge thruster arrays which defined ships of that infamous class, and powered full speed ahead towards the Imperial carrier ships to the rear of the Imperial formation. Mysteriously, its tractors dragged a huge asteroid along behind it. The purpose of the asteroid was revealed as the Might of Huron closed with the Revenge and Stalwart. The interior of the massive rock was hollowed, and inside were hidden scores of Black Legion and Red Corsair boarding parties, supported by Dreadclaw assault pods and short-range orbital flyers. As it neared the Revenge, the Might of Huron released the asteroid, which drifted directly towards the Imperial craft. As soon as it was close enough, tractor beams inside the asteroid grappled the Imperial battleship, and chanting covens of Chaos sorcerers loosed a barrage of psychic attacks that tore down the Imperial ship's defensive shields and blinded its short-range batteries. As soon as the Revenge's energy shields went down, hundreds of assault pods were launched at the now defenseless craft, and a massive boarding action erupted amidst the launch bays and corridors of the ship. The Chaos Space Marines in the boarding parties were quickly reinforced by hosts of horrifying demons, which poured from warp portals that began appearing all across the ship. Within moments, the Revenge was engulfed in a furious battle. Leaving the boarding parties to deal with the Revenge, the might of Huron went after the stalwart, which was ill-suited to a close-range gun battle with a heavily armed Chaos craft. At a stroke, Warlord Irongrasp had turned the tables on the Imperial fleet, negating any advantage the Imperial attack craft might have given them, and leaving them fatally split. Meanwhile, the rest of the Chaos fleet was able to concentrate on crushing the ships of Kranswar's advance guard. Once these ships were destroyed, Irongrasp could finish off the Revenge and Stalwart, if anything remained after the brutal pummeling each was sustaining. As Admiral Kranswar took personal command of one of the security battalions, he knew that his command was almost certainly doomed to destruction. He offered his soul to the immortal Emperor, for it would take a miracle to save his fleet. A rock and a hard place. It was at this vital juncture that the navigators in both fleets began picking up signs of an opening in the warp. Indications that one or more ships were just about to jump into the system. The navigators could hardly believe their senses. Appearing this close to a planetary body was almost suicidal. Nonetheless, the sensors did not lie. Where one moment there was nothing, in the next moment, 4 capital ships and half-dozen escort craft blinked into existence. Seconds later, an 11th, impossibly vast craft appeared, one that dwarfed even the asteroid Irongrasp had used to attack the Revenge. This mighty vessel was the Rock. At a moment of darkest despair, the Dark Angels had arrived. As the Rock and its escorting craft moved to engage the main strength of the Chaos fleet, the Dark Angels' battle barge Unrelenting Fury and 3 Hunter-class escorts swept towards the stricken Revenge. Closing quickly, Unrelenting Fury launched a volley of boarding torpedoes towards the Chaos asteroid. Just as they struck, a phalanx of Terminators teleported onto the rocky surface of the planetoid, their pale armor a beacon against the dark bulk. This was one of those rare times when the Deathwing deployed at their full strength, an event unlikely to occur more than once in a century. They tore into the covens of Chaos Sorcerers on the asteroid with righteous fury, inflicting dozens of casualties even before the Chaos forces knew what had hit them. Moments later, the Dark Angel's boarding torpedoes struck, and with incredible swiftness, the asteroid was engulfed in a battle of its own. Help was also at hand for the Revenge. A silvered strike cruiser arrived alongside the Dark Angel's fleet, and a full brotherhood of Grey Knights materialized within the Revenge's hull to cut a sway through the demon legions swarming through it. They were soon joined by contingents of Dark Angels, aiding the defenders and stemming the tide of the Chaos boarding party's attacks. As the covens on the asteroid died, the portals through which the demons were appearing closed one by one. Hunting parties led by squads of Grey Knights wiped out the last of the demons lurking within the ship. Within hours, no taint of the incursion remained. Although she had been dreadfully damaged, the Revenge was saved, and would continue her vital role in the Pandorax campaign. All around Gaia, the story was the same. The arrival of the Dark Angels swiftly turned the tide against Chaos. The first to feel the Dark Angel's avenging fury was the might of Huron, which was blasted into oblivion by the combined firepower of the Unrelenting Fury the attack squadron launched from the Stalwart. Meanwhile, Warlord Irongrasp found his ships trapped between the battered but still combat-worthy ships of Battlefleet Demeter and the newly arrived Space Marine strike cruisers and escort squadrons. Surrounded on all sides, Irongrasp attempted to break through to the relative safety of the adamantium fields, but his fleet, already damaged in the earlier battles around Gaia, could not succeed. Only half of the ships in the Chaos fleet survived the battle, and those that did were so badly damaged that it took many years to repair them all. Tragically, Admiral Cranswar was slain when he led a defense detail against the renegades that had invaded his flagship, and he did not live to see the fruits of his victory. The triumph of the Imperial forces in space was almost total, leaving Abaddon and his Black Legion trapped and cut off on the surface of Pythos. The reconquest of Pythos, year 960, millennium 41. If Abaddon was worried by this turn of events, he showed no sign. In the months since Pythos had been invaded, the planet had become a demon-infested hell. Greater demons revelled in battle against the saurian monsters that inhabited the planet, and hordes of lesser demons marched on the Delver strongholds. Whenever this gibbering army reached one of the mountainous fortresses, it launched a furious attack, aided by contingents of Black Legion warriors and Red Corsairs sent by Huron Blackheart to aid Abaddon's forces. Although the defenders of the strongholds put up a valiant resistance, they could not hope to hold out for very long. One by one, the strongholds were overrun, and any survivors were marched back to Attica as slaves. What the slaves returned to was not the city that they once knew. Located so close to the corrupting force of the damnation cache, Attica had changed beyond all recognition. Strange, hideously mutated structures had sprouted from the once elegant spire walls. Most of the city had been abandoned, and the population now lived in a network of twisted underground tunnels and caverns that surrounded the damnation cache. Vile smoke and putrid vapours filled the air in the tunnels and belched out through cracks and crevices into the surrounding atmosphere. Most terrible of all, the enslaved population of the city had been struck down by a terrible plague that rendered them to shambling creatures more dead than alive. It was this grim scene of devastation and despair that greeted the victors of the space battles in the adamantium fields. Finally arriving in orbit above the planet, the Imperial fleet immediately began orbital bombardments onto the demonic armies that were assaulting the Delver strongholds. Squadrons of Marauder bombers intensified the bombardment, aided by Xerxes' airborne support wings and Dark Angel's Thunderhead and Talon of Vengeance squadrons. Abaddon's forces were driven back by the overwhelming aerial barrages, allowing companies of Space Marines and regiments of Imperial Guard to relieve the defenders, many of whom had been fighting continuously for over a year. In a brief ceremony, Colonel Strike officially handed over command of the Planetary Defense Force to Commander Azrael of the Dark Angels. Colonel Strike refused all orders to join the other high commanders in the orbiting battle fleets, preferring to return to the fray in his specially modified Baneblade, Traitor's Bane, so that he could fight against the invaders who had cost him so many men. However, although the tide was turning, the Chaos armies continued their relentless assaults on the Delver strongholds. No sooner was one strike driven off than a new one would begin. Abaddon's tactics changed. Instead of making overwhelming and methodical attacks against the strongholds closest to Attica, his legions, supplemented by hounds of Huron raiding parties, attacked wherever the defenders were weakest. No matter how Azrael organized his forces to react to these attacks, he could not always arrive in time. Many smaller strongholds were overrun and their populations enslaved. It quickly became clear to Azrael that firefighting in this way was leading nowhere. He had to strike at the source of the problem. The damnation cache itself would need to be recaptured and resealed. In truth, the Grey Knights accompanying the Dark Angels had been arguing for just such a strike ever since the fleet had arrived over the beleaguered world. Although the Dark Angels harboured a bitter hatred for Abaddon and his allies, Azrael argued that the first priority of the Emperor's armies on Pythos was to shield and protect the planet's citizens. Therefore, the Delver strongholds should be saved before Attica was attacked. It was only when it became clear that Abaddon's forces would continue to launch sporadic attacks against the strongholds, no matter how well protected they were, that Azrael was forced to change his tactics. Assault on Attica, Year 961, Millennium 41. Once the decision was made, the Imperial forces acted quickly to bring the Emperor's wrath to their demonic foes. The assault on Attica was announced by a massive orbital bombardment. The once gleaming Spire city toppled to the ground, and the surrounding area was pounded into wasteland by the combined firepower of the Imperial fleet. In the wake of the bombardment, Thunderhawk gunships and drop pods crashed onto the ravaged battlefield, disgorging the full strength of the Dark Angels chapter, supported by the Grey Knights who had saved the Revenge. Even the Black Legion and the hordes of demons at Abaddon's command could not resist such a hammer blow, and they were quickly driven underground by the fury of the Imperial attack. The second wave of the assault swiftly followed. Scores of orbital transports landed around the bridgehead the Space Marines had established, disgorging regiment after regiment of Imperial Guard onto the steaming mire left by the orbital attack. Colonel Strike was one of the first to land amidst the ruins of the city. The hoary survivor had been given command of the Imperial Guard assault army by Azrael himself, and was determined to see the campaign to its brutal conclusion. The Imperial Guard regiments arrived not a moment too soon, as wave after wave of vile demons poured forth from the ravaged underground tunnels, having scented blood. Many Imperial Guard platoons and their accompanying armoured support had only just mustered in their position at the perimeter of the bridgehead when the demon horde struck. Las guns and battle cannons tore gaping holes in the charging ranks of demons, but as one infernal creature fell, 10 more stood ready to take its place. Soon the whole Imperial front line was engulfed in a terrible melee, as Guardsmen and Space Marines battled furiously against creatures spawned by the warp. Bayonets were fixed and chainsaws activated in a desperate defense against the talons and blades of the demonic host. Then the guns of the orbital Imperial fleet fired into the warp-spawned horde. The massive macro cannon shells and strikes of their lance batteries smashed into the ground dangerously close to the hand-to-hand combat being fought all around the bridgehead. Each titanic blast lifted scores of bodies into the air to fall amongst the swirling combatants. Even as the warp-spawned demon horde could not withstand such hammer blows, and against the massed firepower of the fleet, the attack faltered and finally stopped. Around the implacable Space Marines, the weary wounded guardsmen drew breath, relieved to see tunnel mouths empty and quiet. All around the bridgehead, the ground was covered in the slowly dematerializing remains of more than 100,000 demons. Within an hour, the bodies were gone, returned to the realm of chaos that had spawned them. They left the battlefield eerily barren, strewn only with Imperial corpses and the blackened shells of wrecked tanks. The Underground War. With the bridgehead established, Azrael began the grim task of clearing a path to the damnation cache itself. The underground tunnels and caverns were defended bitterly by newly summoned demons and Chaos Space Marines under Abaddon's command, but the Imperial attackers were implacable. The cave system was vast and incredibly complex. Tunnels branched and intertwined, some of them narrowing so that even infantry could only advance in single file, while others were so massive that they formed vast underground caverns, large enough to allow Deathstrike Vortex missile batteries and hunting packs of Warhound Titans to bring their long-range weapons to bear. Unnumbered battles and firefights were fought within the Stygian darkness below Attica, but slowly, yard by yard, the Imperial forces battled their way through the darkened tunnels. As they closed in upon the damnation cache, the demons and Chaos Space Marines were joined by shambling hordes of mutant zombies. They were the surviving remains of the once proud citizens of Attica, enslaved ever since Abaddon had captured the planet and now horrifically transformed by the warp effects of the Chaos Portal. Gritting their teeth, the Imperial attackers forged on through the foes, every step taking them closer to the damnation cache itself. Even though the situation around the cache was becoming increasingly desperate, Abaddon continued to launch raids on the Delver strongholds, even leading several of the attacks personally. Azrael, however, no longer allowed this to distract him from his purpose. Spearheaded by the Dark Angels and Grey Knights, the forces of Chaos were driven ever further back, until the damnation cache was almost in Imperial hands. However, just as Abaddon seemed defeated, a fresh flotilla of Red Corsairs raiders suddenly appeared in the system. Breaking through the Imperial cordon, they rendezvoused with Abaddon in the jungle, and their orbital transport craft quickly evacuated the surviving Chaos Space Marines from locations scattered all over Pythos. Although the Imperial fleet was able to destroy some of the Red Corsair transports, the majority made it to the ships hidden in orbit and escaped. Hours later, an Imperial assault seized the damnation cache, and the Grey Knights began the arduous process of re-establishing the wards that would seal it once again. The Pandorax incursion had finally been defeated, but at huge cost. Aftermath. In the wake of Abaddon's escape and the resealing of the damnation cache, the Dark Angels and Grey Knights left Pythos. Colonel Strike was left in command of the 2 Imperial Guard armies that had taken part in the reconquest, and has been fighting a decades-long campaign to cleanse the planet of any lingering demonic infestation ever since. Although the damnation cache was resealed, the damage it inflicted was severe, and many minor warp rifts still need to be closed. The war carries on to this day. Why Abaddon attacked the Pandorax system remains a mystery. However, there are recurring rumors that his aim was not one of conquest, but of discovery. It is said that the ruinous power sent Abaddon a vision which revealed that, hidden among the population of Pythos, he would find a powerful psyker whose latent abilities would ensure victory in his coming crusade against the Imperium. Decades later, the Dark Angels heard whispers that a mysterious psyker of prodigious power had ordered the capture of an artifact known as the Hellfire Stone. These rumors were confirmed when a Dark Angel's force clashed with Chaos renegades searching for the artifact on the Imperial planet of Bane's Landing. In his sanctum, Azrael remembered the campaign he had fought against Abaddon all those years before. Perhaps, he thought, as he made the connection, Abaddon was not defeated on Pythos at all. Perhaps he had left because he had acquired exactly what he had been looking for. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. If you have enjoyed these stories, then do consider liking and subscribing, and tipping with a super thanks if I've earned your bounty this day. There is a link to the Patreon in the video description also, if you feel that generous. But more importantly, now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.